Hello everyone. I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The Salt-Stained Lullabies of Porthcawl Light. Chapter 1, The Last Entry. The North Cornish coast, even in late September, possessed a raw, untamed beauty that Elias Vance found perversely comforting. The boat, a sturdy fishing trawler named the Puffin's Rest, bucked and slammed against the gray, choppy water, sending plumes of icy spray over the bow. Elias, hunched in his weatherproof gear, clutched the strap of his satchel, its contents, his preliminary research notes, a set of archival tools, and a well-thumbed edition of Maritime Disasters of the Western Approaches, his only companions for the next 3 weeks. The boatman, a man named Iago whose face seemed carved from weathered granite, hadn't spoken more than a dozen words since they'd left Port Isaac. Now, as a jagged headland loomed out of the sea mist, crowned by the stark silhouette of Porthcawl Lighthouse, Iago finally grunted. "Porthcawl. She don't like company much." "So I gather," Elias replied, his voice tight. The lighthouse, even from this distance, looked like a fossilized sentinel, its stone dark and slick with damp. The keeper's cottage huddled beside it, a low, brooding structure seemingly clinging to the rock for dear life. "Wind sings old songs round here," Iago continued, his gaze fixed on the treacherous approach. "Listen too hard, you'll hear more than you bargained for." He cut the engine, letting the boat drift towards a crude stone jetty. "Be back for ye, 3 weeks. Weather permit tin. The implication was clear, the weather often didn't permit. Elias, late 30s with a receding hairline and the perpetually tired eyes of someone who preferred the company of the dead to the living, had sought this isolation. After the quiet implosion of his small, specialist bookshop and the subsequent, equally quiet, end of a relationship that had run its course years before it officially concluded, the offer to archive Porthcawl's contents had felt like a lifeline. Or perhaps, a fitting entombment. He was a man of paper and dust, of catalogued sorrows and forgotten histories. Porthcawl promised all of that, in spades. Iago helped him unload his meager supplies, crates of tinned food, bottled water, fuel for the generator, and his personal trunk. Then, with a curt nod, the boatman was gone, the chug of the Puffin's Rest fading into the roar of the surf. Elias was alone. The wind, a relentless, keening presence, whipped around him, tasting of salt and something else, an old, cold sorrow. He hauled his belongings up the slippery path to the cottage, the iron key Iago had given him grating loudly in the ancient lock. Inside, the cottage was a time capsule. Dust lay thick as snow on the draped furniture. The air was heavy with the scent of brine, mildew, and the faint, ghostly aroma of pipe tobacco. It was surprisingly intact, as if the last keeper had, as the brief from the Trinity House Historical Society had suggested, simply walked away mid-task. Books, mostly maritime manuals and almanacs, lined salt-warped shelves. Charts, yellowed and brittle, were tacked to one wall. A half-finished game of solitaire lay on a small table, the cards faded. Elias set about making the place habitable, his meticulous nature asserting itself. He uncovered furniture, swept floors gritty with sand and salt, and coaxed the ancient generator in the outhouse into a grumbling, protesting life. By late afternoon, a weak yellow light pushed back the gloom in the main room, and a small electric heater valiantly battled the pervasive chill. The storm hit just after dusk. It came with a savage fury, rain lashing the small, salt-caked windows like handfuls of gravel, the wind shrieking around the eaves like a tormented banshee. The lighthouse tower, connected to the cottage by a short, covered stone walkway, seemed to groan under the assault, the sound resonating through the very fabric of the cottage. Elias made himself a sparse meal of tinned stew and stale bread, eaten by the light of a paraffin lamp as the generator sputtered erratically. The isolation, which he'd craved, now felt absolute, pressed in by the storm and the immense, indifferent darkness beyond the windows. He decided to make a preliminary survey of the desk in the small room he'd designated as his office. It was a solid oak piece, scarred and ink-stained. Most drawers were empty, or contained mundane items, dried-up inkwells, blunt nibs, scraps of nautical twine. The bottom right drawer, however, stuck. After some jiggling, it yielded with a reluctant groan. Inside, nestled beneath a stack of tied tables, was a small, leather-bound journal. Its cover was stiff, the leather cracked and bearing the ghostly imprint of a cup ring. The paper within was brittle, the ink faded to a rusty brown. He opened it carefully. The script was spidery, precise. It seemed to be a personal log, not an official keeper's record. Entries detailed weather patterns, bird sightings, the loneliness of the watches. Elias skimmed through, his archivist's curiosity piqued. The entries were dated, spanning several years in the early 1920s. He flipped towards the end. The last entry was dated September 27, 1923. Exactly 100 years ago. To the day. A shiver, unrelated to the cottage's chill, traced its way down Elias's spine. He read the final words, his breath catching in his throat. The fog is a shroud, thick and unyielding. Ilara sees him in it, she says. The boy from the sea. Always the boy. I hear nothing but the lamps turning, a heartbeat in the stone. But the light seems dimmer tonight, failing against this oppressive gray. My own work falters. He's come again. The archivist. He doesn't know it yet. Elias stared at the words. The archivist. A bizarre coincidence, surely. Some local legend Iago had neglected to mention, a story about a visiting official perhaps. Or a prank. Could Iago have planted this? But the journal felt authentically old, the ink and paper consistent with the period. Then he looked closer at the handwriting. That precise, slightly cramped script. The way that T's were crossed with a small, decisive flick, the loops of the G's and Y's, the distinctive formation of the capital A. His blood turned to ice. He scrambled for his satchel, pulling out his own notebook, the one filled with his meticulous research notes for this very project. He opened it, his hand trembling, and laid it beside the old journal. The lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows. The handwriting was identical. Not similar. Identical. His own. A wave of vertigo washed over him. He slammed the journal shut, a sudden, irrational fear gripping him. The wind howled outside, its voice no longer just the cry of the elements, but something mocking, knowing. He pushed the journal back into the drawer, his movements jerky. A prank. It had to be. A very elaborate, very unsettling prank. But how? Who would know he was coming, know his handwriting? He stood up, pacing the small confines of the room. His heart hammered against his ribs. The rhythmic pulse he'd attributed to the generator, or the storm, suddenly seemed different. He strained his ears. Above the wind, above the rain, was there another sound? A faint, rhythmic creak, like the turning mechanism of a great lamp. But the Porthgero light had been extinguished for decades. Its mechanism was frozen, its lenses cracked. He'd read the decommissioning report himself. He shook his head violently. Stress. Isolation. An overactive imagination fueled by a century-old diary and a dramatic storm. That was all. He was Elias Vance, a pragmatic man of facts and documentation. There was a logical explanation. There had to be. But as he lay in his cold, narrow bed later that night, the wind's lamentations seeping through the stone walls, the image of that final entry, in handwriting that was undeniably his own, burned behind his eyelids. He's come again. The archivist. He doesn't know it yet. And the phantom creak of the lighthouse lamp, steady and inexorable as a dying heartbeat, seemed to answer. Chapter 2, Whispers in the Dust. The storm blew itself out by morning, leaving behind a world washed clean and glittering under a pale, watery sun. The sea, however, remained a cauldron of churning gray, its waves crashing against the cliffs with undiminished fury. The air was sharp, laden with the smell of ozone and kelp. Elias woke feeling unrest, the journal's final entry replaying in his mind. He made a pot of strong, bitter coffee on the camping stove, the generator was still stubbornly silent, and forced himself to eat. He needed to establish a routine, to impose order on the unsettling chaos of the previous night. Work. That was the answer. He retrieved the journal from the drawer, his hand hesitating for a moment. In the stark light of day, it seemed less menacing, merely an old, forgotten book. He examined the handwriting again, comparing it minutely with his own. The similarities were uncanny, undeniable. But he forced himself towards rational explanations. Perhaps his own handwriting, unknown to him, mirrored a common style from that era. Or perhaps, in a moment of exhaustion or subconscious mimicry while taking initial notes, he had somehow influenced his perception. It was a flimsy shield against the unease, but he clung to it. He decided to start with the official lighthouse logs, stored in a tin trunk in what must have been the keeper's main living area. These were more promisingly mundane, meticulous records of lamp maintenance, fuel consumption, weather observations, passing ships. The names of the keepers changed over the decades. He searched for the period around 1923, the date of the unsettling journal entry. The keeper then was a Thomas Ashton. His entries were neat, precise, professional. But as Elias cross-referenced the dates with the personal journal, if it was indeed Ashton's, a subtle shift occurred. In the weeks leading up to September 27, 1923, Ashton's official log entries became shorter, more perfunctory. The flourishing script sometimes faltered, as if written by a tired or trembling hand. The personal journal, which Elias now reluctantly acknowledged he must study, painted a more vivid, troubling picture. Thomas Ashton wrote of his wife, Elara, and their young daughter, Lily, who was perhaps 5 or 6. Elara, it seemed, was prone to melancholy, exacerbated by the profound isolation of Porthgero. Lily was a bright, imaginative child, her world populated by unseen friends and stories spun from the sea and sky. August 10, 1923. Elara grows quieter. She stares out at the sea for hours. Says the waves whisper Lily's name. The child, thank heavens, remains cheerful. Her laughter is the only light that pierces this gloom some days. September 5, 1923. A fierce gale. The lamp struggled. Lily drew a picture today, the lighthouse, with a dark shape hovering by the lantern room. She said it was the shadow man watching the light. Children's fancies, but it chilled me nonetheless. Elias felt a prickle of disquiet. He was an archivist, his job was to observe, to document, not to feel. But the raw humanity in these faded pages was undeniable. He spent the morning cataloging, meticulously noting each document, its condition, its provenance. The rhythmic crash of the waves was a constant soundtrack. But beneath it, or perhaps woven into it, he began to discern other sounds. The faint, almost inaudible sigh of the wind through a loose windowpane that seemed to form a word, cold, or lost. He'd check the window, find it sealed tight. The creak of a floorboard in an empty room. Once, he was certain he heard the distant, tinkling notes of a child's lullaby, so faint it might have been the gulls crying or the wind whistling through a crack in the stonework. He dismissed them. The cottage was old buildings made noises. His ears were playing tricks on him, conditioned by the boatman's ominous words and that damnable journal entry. Around midday, while sifting through a box of miscellaneous papers, receipts, letters, scraps of charts, he found a small, pressed flower. A sea pink, its color faded to a delicate blush, tucked between the pages of a tide table dated 1922. It was a common flower on these cliffs, but its careful preservation spoke of a gentle hand. Elara's, perhaps. Or Lily's. He set it aside and continued. Later, as he returned to that box, he frowned. The sea pink was gone. He searched the table, the floor around his chair. Nothing. Had he imagined finding it? No, he was sure he'd held it, noted its fragility. He was meticulous. He didn't misplace things. A cold spot seemed to settle in the corner of the room, making the hairs on his arms stand on end, despite the weak sun filtering through the window. He rubbed his arms, attributing it to a draft. The afternoon brought a fresh discovery. Tucked inside a heavy volume on coastal navigation was a series of child's drawings, executed in thick, smudged charcoal. They depicted stick figures, a tall man, a woman with long, flowing hair, and a smaller child. In several, they stood before the lighthouse. But in the later drawings, the tone shifted. The stick figures were often alone, looking out at a turbulent sea. In one, the child figure stood at the base of the lighthouse, looking up at the lantern room where a crude, shadowy figure was drawn inside, its form indistinct but undeniably menacing. Lily's Shadow Man. Elias felt a knot tighten in his stomach. These weren't just historical artifacts, they were pieces of a life, tinged with a growing unease that mirrored his own. As evening approached, and the light began to fail, he tried the generator again. This time, with a reluctant cough and a plume of oily smoke, it chugged into life, providing a more stable, if still dim, electrical supply. The relief was immense. He was preparing another solitary meal when he heard it. A distinct, soft thud from the room he used as his office. He froze, listening. Silence, apart from the generator's drone and the sea. He told himself it was a book falling from a pile, the old cottage settling. But a thread of anxiety pulled at him. Armed with a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, he cautiously approached the office door, pushing it open slowly. Nothing seemed out of place. His papers were as he'd left them. The drawers were closed. Then he saw it. On the dusty floorboards, near the desk where he'd found the journal, was a small, carved wooden toy boat. No more than 3 inches long, its paint faded, its tiny mast broken. He hadn't seen it before. He was certain of it. He'd swept this room himself. He would have noticed. He picked it up. It was cold to the touch, smooth with age. It felt strangely significant, a deliberate offering. His heart thumped. This was no longer ignorable. Objects didn't just materialize. The faint scent of lavender, delicate and old-fashioned, wafted through the air. It wasn't his. He used unscented soap, had no toiletries that could produce such a smell. It reminded him of his grandmother's linen drawer, a scent from a forgotten time. Ilara's, perhaps. He backed out of the room, the little boat clutched in his hand, the poker suddenly feeling inadequate. The wind outside seemed to pick up, its sighs morphing into something that sounded like a woman's soft, mournful weeping. He looked back at the desk. At the bottom right drawer. He's come again. The archivist. Elias dropped the toy boat as if it had burned him. It clattered onto the stone floor of the main room. He didn't want to know. He wanted to pack his bags, wait on the jetty, and pray Iago returned early. But the sea was too wild, the headland too remote. He was trapped. Trapped with the salt-stained lullabies of Porthgaro light, and a story that was slowly, inexorably, drawing him in. Chapter 3, The Shifting Script. The third day dawned gray and oppressive. A thick, disorienting fog had rolled in overnight, swallowing the headland whole. The lighthouse tower was a ghostly smudge against the gray, its top lost in the swirling vapor. The world had shrunk to the confines of the cottage and the small, treacherous patch of ground around it. The constant roar of the unseen sea was more menacing than ever. Elias felt as though the fog had seeped into his mind, blurring the edges of his carefully constructed pragmatism. The appearance of the toy boat, the scent of lavender, the persistent, faint lullaby that seemed to weave in and out of the wind's moan, these were no longer easily dismissible. He found himself jumping at every creak of the old cottage, his senses preternaturally heightened. He avoided the office that morning, focusing instead on sorting through a sea chest filled with more impersonal items, spare lamp wicks, tins of brass polish, coils of rope, a collection of seashells. He catalogued them with a ferocity born of distraction, his handwriting in his own logbook growing tighter, more compact. But Porthgero, it seemed, would not let him ignore its secrets. He found a tattered woman's shawl tucked beneath a pile of old oilskins. It was made of fine wool, once perhaps a vibrant blue, now faded to a muted gray-green. It smelled faintly of seawater, lavender, and something else, despair. He held it for a long moment, an image of Alara Ashton flashing in his mind, a slender woman with haunted eyes, staring out at the relentless fog. He carefully folded it and placed it with the other items he'd identified as potentially personal. Later, needing to consult Thomas Ashton's official logbook again, he reluctantly entered the office. The toy boat still lay where he'd dropped it, a small, defiant accusation on the floor. He ignored it, pulling the heavy logbook from its shelf. He opened it to the entries for September 1923, intending to compare a specific weather notation with a chart. But the page he turned to wasn't right. The neat, official entries were there, but beneath them, scrawled diagonally across the page in a frantic, spidery hand that was definitely not Thomas Ashton's usual script, were new words. She sings to him. The boy in the waves. Lily hears her too. I must keep the light strong. The light keeps them out. Elias's breath hitched. He stared, his mind reeling. This wasn't there yesterday. He knew it wasn't. He had examined these pages meticulously. The ink was a different shade, blacker, fresher looking, yet it seemed to soak into the old paper as if it belonged. He flipped through the logbook. More such additions appeared, scattered through the entries of August and September 1923, desperate, fragmented phrases, interwoven with Ashton's official business. The fog has teeth. Alara walks the cliff edge. Whispering. Lily's boat, gone. Taken by the tide, or him. This last entry, scrawled beneath a notation about a low barometer, made him look at the toy boat on the floor. Lily's boat. His carefully maintained composure began to fray. He felt a tremor in his hands. Was he losing his mind? Was the isolation, the strange atmosphere of this place, causing him to hallucinate, to project his own growing unease onto these inanimate objects? He retreated from the office, a cold dread settling deep in his bones. He made himself more coffee, lacing it heavily with sugar, hoping to dispel the fog in his head. He needed to be methodical. He would document these changes in his own notebook. He sat at the main room table, opened his notebook, and uncapped his pen. He began to write, October 1st, significant alterations noted in Keeper Ashton's official logbook. Apparent new entries, anachronistic. His hand paused. He looked down at the words he had just written. The script was neat, familiar. His own. But as he continued to write, a strange sensation crept into his fingers, a subtle resistance, a guiding force. He tried to write anachronistic, but his hand formed the word warning. He stared at it. He tried again, concentrating fiercely, anachronistic. The pen moved, forming the letters remember. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through him. He dropped the pen as if it were venomous. He flexed his fingers, staring at his own hand as if it belonged to a stranger. Was this what happened to Thomas Ashton? Did the house, the isolation, the presence, begin to speak through him? The rhythmic creak of the phantom lamp, which had become an almost constant background hum in his perception, seemed to grow louder, more insistent. Creak, pause, creak. Like a giant, rusty metronome counting down. He got up, needing air, needing to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the cottage. He pulled on his boots and jacket and stepped out into the fog. It was like walking into milk. Visibility was down to a few feet. The air was clammy, tasting of salt. The path to the lighthouse tower was barely discernible. He found himself drawn towards it, as if an invisible cord were pulling him. The short, covered walkway connecting the cottage to the tower was dark and tunnel-like. The heavy iron door to the lighthouse itself was stiff but unlocked. Inside, the air was bitingly cold, thick with the smell of rust, damp stone, and that faint, unsettling metallic tang he'd noticed on his first day, like old blood. A spiral staircase of iron wound upwards into the gloom. Each footstep echoed unnaturally in the confined space. He climbed, his hand trailing along the cold, damp wall. With each turn, the sounds of the sea and wind seemed to recede, replaced by the internal thrumming of the phantom lamp mechanism, which now felt as if it were resonating within his own chest, a second, alien heartbeat. He reached the lantern room. It was a cage of iron and thick, salt-caked glass. The great lamp mechanism stood silent and broken, its intricate lenses cracked and dull. Dust lay thick everywhere. Yet, as he stood there, peering out into the impenetrable fog, he could have sworn he saw a flicker, a brief, ghostly pulse of light from the heart of the inert machine. And then, a new sound, delicate and clear amidst the phantom creaks and the distant moan of the wind, a child humming. A simple, repetitive tune. A lullaby. It seemed to come from directly behind him. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. The lantern room was empty. Just the broken lamp, the dust, the cold. But on the grimy floor, near the base of the lamp pedestal, was a single, small, muddy footprint. Too small for an adult. Child-sized. And it was fresh. The mud was still damp. Elias stumbled back, his hand flying to his mouth to stifle a cry. He scrambled for the stairs, his descent clumsy and panicked, the iron steps ringing with his flight. He burst out of the tower and back into the relative safety of the cottage, slamming the connecting doors shut, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The toy boat still lay on the floor. He snatched it up, his earlier fear replaced by a desperate anger. He flung open the cottage door and hurled the boat out into the fog, towards the cliff edge. "Leave me alone," he yelled, his voice hoarse, immediately swallowed by the thick, damp air. He slammed the door, leaning against it, trembling. The generator, which had been chugging along reliably, suddenly coughed, sputtered, and died. The cottage was plunged into a disorienting twilight, the only light now the weak, gray luminescence filtering through the fogged windows. And from the other side of the door, carried on the first stirring of a renewed wind, he heard it again, the faint, tinkling notes of the lullaby, closer this time, and a soft, childish giggle. Then, a gentle scratching at the door, as if a small hand were trying to find the latch. Chapter 4, The Echo Chamber. Darkness, thick and absolute, descended with the generator's failure. Elias fumbled for his torch, its beam cutting a nervous swathe through the gloom. The scratching at the door stopped, but the silence that followed was somehow worse, charged with an expectant quality. He backed away from the door, his breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. He spent a miserable hour trying to coax the generator back to life, his fingers numb, the fog swirling around him like a sentient thing. It was no use. The machine was dead. His supply of paraffin for the lamps was limited, he'd have to ration it. Back inside the cottage, the cold was palpable. It wasn't just the absence of the heater, it was a bone-deep chill that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the building. He lit a single paraffin lamp, its flickering light casting long, dancing shadows that turned familiar objects into grotesque caricatures. His dreams that night were a chaotic torrent of images and sounds. He was Thomas Ashton, standing in the lantern room, the great lamp whirling, its light pushing back a tangible, monstrous fog. He felt Alara's despair as she walked the cliff path, her shawl pulled tight, whispering to the waves. He saw through Lily's eyes, a small hand clutching a toy boat, looking up at a shadowy figure in the lighthouse. He heard the lullaby, not as a faint, distant tune, but sung clearly by a woman's voice, full of sorrow. And through it all, the rhythmic creak of the lamp, his lamp, the one he had to keep turning. He woke with a gasp, tangled in his damp blankets, the phantom creak echoing in his ears. The taste of salt was strong in his mouth, as if he'd been breathing seawater. The fog remained for another day, a suffocating blanket. Elias moved through the cottage like a ghost himself, the line between his experiences and the fragmented lives he was uncovering blurring with each passing hour. He found himself talking aloud, sometimes as Elias, sometimes as Thomas, arguing with the silence, with the whispering wind. The subtle phenomena intensified. Objects didn't just move slightly. A book he'd placed on the mantelpiece was found open on the floor, its pages riffled as if by an unseen reader. The scent of lavender was sometimes overpowering, then would vanish abruptly. Cold spots roamed the cottage like invisible entities. He forced himself back to the archives, driven by a desperate need to understand, to find a pattern in the encroaching madness. He discovered a bundle of Elara Ashton's letters, tied with a faded ribbon, tucked away in a hatbox. They were addressed to a sister in Penzance, many of them unposted. Her early letters were full of a nervous optimism, descriptions of the rugged beauty of Porthcawl, her love for Thomas, her joy in Lily. But gradually, the tone darkened. The isolation weighs heavily, dear sister. Thomas is consumed by the light. He says it is his sacred duty. But I fear it is consuming him. He barely sleeps. And Lily, she speaks of a friend, the boy from the waves, who whispers stories to her. I try to distract her, but the sea has a powerful hold here. The fog, it's been days. I feel trapped. Thomas grows distant, his eyes hold a fever I don't recognize. He mumbles in his sleep about the archivist and keeping the light pure. What archivist? No one comes here but the supply boat. Elias's blood ran cold at the mention of the archivist in Elara's hand. It wasn't just in that one journal entry. It was part of Thomas's descent. The final letter was smudged, tear-stained, almost incoherent. He took her. The sea, or the shadow in the light, I don't know. Lily is gone. Thomas blames himself, blames the lamp for failing. He won't speak. He just stares at the empty cot. I hear her singing sometimes, her little lullaby, carried on the wind. Or perhaps it is just my own heart breaking. Porthcawl has taken everything. There were no more letters. No more entries in Thomas Ashton's personal journal after that fateful September 27, 1923. The official log simply stopped. Grief, sharp and profound, pierced through Elias's fear. The tragedy of this lost family felt immediate, visceral. Lily, drowned or lost. Elara, consumed by sorrow. Thomas, broken by guilt and the crushing weight of his perceived failure. He found a small, child's shoe, worn and misshapen, tucked under the loose floorboard beneath where Lily's cot might have stood. Holding it, he felt an overwhelming wave of sorrow, so potent it brought tears to his eyes. He was no longer just an archivist, he was a conduit, an echo chamber for their pain. The weather finally broke on the fifth day. The fog lifted, revealing a wild, wind-swept coastline under a bruised purple sky. The wind still howled, but it felt cleaner, less oppressive. Yet, the change in weather brought no relief to Elias. The presence in the cottage, in the lighthouse, felt more focused, more insistent. He began to find his own research notes subtly altered. Words crossed out, new phrases inserted in that chillingly familiar script. A grocery list he'd made had an addition at the bottom, lavender soap. Small white pebbles for Lily. He noticed his reflection in the salt-grimed window of the kitchen. For a fleeting second, the face staring back wasn't his. It was thinner, more angular, with haunted, deep-set eyes, the face from his dreams, Thomas Ashton's face. He recoiled, stumbling back, and when he looked again, it was just Elias, pale and unshaven, but undeniably himself. The lullaby was almost constant now, a faint, heartbreaking melody that seemed to emanate from the walls, the floor, the very air around him. He started humming it unconsciously, the tune embedding itself in his mind. He felt a growing compulsion to return to the lighthouse tower. Not to the lantern room, not yet. but to its base. There was a storeroom there, according to an old floor plan he'd found, a place he hadn't yet explored, assuming it held only more mundane supplies. He took a crowbar from the outhouse, the generator remained stubbornly dead, and a fresh paraffin lamp. The door to the storeroom was at the back of the tower, facing the cliff edge, half hidden by overgrown gorse. It was boarded up, the wood weathered and gray. It took considerable effort to pry the boards loose. They came away with a shriek of rusted nails, revealing a heavy, salt-encrusted wooden door. It was unlocked. He pushed it open. The air that billowed out was fetid, rank with decay and the overwhelming smell of stagnant seawater. He raised the lamp. The room was small, stone-lined. Most of it was empty, save for a pile of sodden, rotting canvas in one corner. But in the center of the room, on the damp earth floor, was a dark stain. And scattered around it, half buried in the dirt, were fragments of something small and white. He knelt, his hand trembling as he reached out. Porcelain. Fragments of a broken porcelain doll. A tiny hand, a piece of a painted cheek with a staring blue eye, a shard of a delicate, smiling mouth. And beside it, almost completely buried, was a small, waterlogged wooden toy boat. Identical to the one he had thrown over the cliff. A wave of nausea hit him. This was where it had happened. This was where Lily. He scrambled back, a choked sound escaping him. He had to get out. He had to tell someone. But who? Iago wasn't due for over 2 weeks. There was no phone, no radio. He was alone with the Ashtons. And they wanted him to know. They wanted him to feel. As he stumbled out of the storeroom, his gaze was drawn upwards, towards the lantern room. The sun was beginning to set, painting the western sky in bloody streaks of orange and crimson. For a moment, just a fleeting instant, he saw it. A light. A steady, pulsing glow from the lantern of Porthgarrow. He blinked, and it was gone. The lenses were dark, lifeless. But he had seen it. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the marrow, what they wanted. What Thomas, in his guilt and madness, had failed to do, and what, the archivist, was now here to complete. The light had to burn again. Chapter 5, The Salt-Stained Lullaby. The compulsion to relight the lamp became an obsession, a fever that burned away Elias's remaining pragmatism. He was no longer Elias Vance, meticulous archivist. He was an instrument, a vessel for a century-old grief and a desperate, unfulfilled need. The Ashtons were with him, in him. Ilara's sorrow was a weight in his chest, Lily's lost laughter echoed in his ears, and Thomas's frantic determination guided his hands. He spent the next few days in a frenzy of activity, fueled by little food and even less sleep. He scavenged. The original lamp mechanism was beyond repair, its delicate clockwork a rusted, frozen sculpture. But there were spare parts in the tower's lower levels, old burners, canisters of miraculously preserved whale oil, wicks thick as his thumb. He found Thomas Ashton's detailed notes on the lamp's operation, his handwriting, that familiar, precise script, guiding him. The cottage seemed to aid him. Tools he needed appeared in obvious places. A crucial diagram he'd overlooked was found lying open on the desk. The faint lullaby became a constant companion, sometimes soothing, sometimes mournful, urging him on. The physical manifestations became more direct. One morning, he woke to find small, wet handprints on the dusty windowsill of his bedroom, leading from the window towards his bed. Child-sized. He no longer felt fear, only a profound, aching sadness. Almost there, Lily, he whispered to the empty room, his voice raspy. He found himself speaking aloud in Thomas Ashton's voice, muttering about the importance of the light, about keeping the darkness at bay. He'd catch himself, a flicker of his old self recoiling in horror, but the tide of the past was too strong, pulling him under. His own journal entries became indistinguishable from the one he'd found on that first night. The handwriting merged completely. He wrote of Ilara's fear, of Lily's games, of the shadows in the fog. He wrote of the archivist, who had come to help, who understood the weight of the task. He was writing his own history, and Thomas Ashton's, simultaneously. The final piece of the puzzle was the great lens itself. Many sections were cracked, some shattered. But he found spare panes, thick and heavy, stored in wooden crates. With agonizing effort, using ropes and pulleys he rigged himself, he began the task of replacing the damaged sections. He worked day and night, the paraffin lamp casting a meager glow in the vast lantern room, the wind shrieking outside like a chorus of lost souls. The phantom creak of the lamp was deafening now, a pounding rhythm in his head, in his blood. It was the heartbeat of Porthgero, and it was failing. Only he could restore it. On what he vaguely calculated was his 14th night at Porthgero, he was ready. The makeshift burner was assembled, the wicks soaked in oil, the lenses as clear as he could make them. The wind had dropped to an eerie calm, the sea a dark, whispering presence below. Stars, cold and distant, glittered in the black sky. He stood before the lamp, a box of matches in his trembling hand. This was it. The culmination of his work, of Thomas's tormented vigil. He struck a match. The flare illuminated his face, gaunt, wild-eyed, his hair matted. He looked like a man possessed, or a man on the brink of an abyss. He touched the flame to the wicks. They caught, sputtered, then bloomed into a warm, yellow light. He adjusted the burner, and the flame grew, filling the lantern room with a soft, pulsing radiance. The light. Porthgero's light, burning again after decades of darkness. A profound sense of peace settled over him, a strange, calm exhaustion. He had done it. He had fulfilled the task. He looked out through the newly cleaned lenses. The beam cut a swathe through the darkness, reaching out over the restless sea. And then he saw them. Not a physical seeing, but a knowing, a feeling. Ilara, standing on the cliff path below, her face turned up towards the light, a faint, sad smile on her lips. Lily, a small, translucent figure, dancing at the edge of the waves, her laughter finally free of sorrow, carried on the gentle breeze. And Thomas, standing beside him in the lantern room, his hand resting lightly on Elias's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement, a shared burden finally laid to rest. The phantom creak of the lamp faded, replaced by the gentle, rhythmic sigh of the burner. The lullaby, no longer mournful, but soft and soothing, filled the air, then slowly, gradually, dissolved into the murmur of the sea. Elias sank to the floor, overwhelmed. He didn't know how long he sat there, watching the light pulse, feeling the echoes of the past recede, leaving behind a quiet emptiness. When dawn broke, painting the sky in soft pastels, Elias was still in the lantern room. He felt, hollowed out. Changed. He looked at his hands. They were his own again, but they bore the grime and calluses of Thomas Ashton's labor. He made his way slowly down the spiral stairs, out of the tower, and into the cottage. It felt different. Quieter. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted. The faint scent of lavender was gone. The cold spots had vanished. The toy boat, the one he had thrown over the cliff, sat on the kitchen table. Beside it lay the small, pressed sea pink. Offerings, or perhaps, tokens of gratitude. He spent the next week meticulously documenting his findings, his professional instincts slowly reasserting themselves. He wrote of the Ashtons, of their tragedy, of the strange phenomena. He described the relighting of the lamp, though he knew that part would be dismissed as delusion, the product of isolation and stress. His handwriting was once again his own, though perhaps a little shakier, a little less precise than before. When Iago's boat, the Puffin's Rest, finally appeared on the horizon, exactly 3 weeks after dropping him off, Elias was waiting on the jetty. His crates were packed, the archival materials carefully organized. Iago eyed him strangely. "Ye look like ye've seen a ghost, Mr. Vance." Elias managed a weak smile. "Several, I think." "Porthgero does that," Iago said, his expression unreadable. "Heard the old songs, did ye?" I think, Elias said, looking back at the lighthouse, its lamp now dark and silent once more in the daylight, I think I helped them finish one. As the boat pulled away, Elias kept his gaze fixed on Porthgero. He had come seeking refuge in order and documentation, a solitary man delving into the past. He was leaving with a story etched into his soul, a story of sorrow, of remembrance, and of a light that, for one brief night, had pierced a century of darkness. He was still an archivist. But he knew now that some archives are not contained in paper and ink, but are written in salt and sorrow, carried on the wind, and remembered, piece by piece, by those who are willing to listen to their salt-stained lullabies. In his satchel, nestled amongst his notes, was a small, carved wooden boat. He didn't remember packing it. He also found, later, when unpacking in his quiet London flat, that the final page of his own personal journal for the Porthgero assignment was filled with a single, repeated phrase, written in that precise, spidery script that was, and was not, his own. The light remembers. The archivist remembers. We are at peace. He never returned to the Cornish coast, but sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind sighed around his city windows, he could almost hear the faint, rhythmic creak of a distant lamp, and the soft, fading notes of a child's lullaby. And he would know that Porthgero, and its family, were not entirely gone. The grit of salt and the persistent damp of Porthgero had already worked their way into Elias Vance's bones by the third day. He'd anticipated the isolation, even welcomed it after the quiet implosion of his career at the National Maritime Museum, a disagreement over archival methods, they'd called it, a betrayal of historical integrity, he'd maintained. This remote Cornish lighthouse, a stony sentinel on a forgotten finger of land, was meant to be a bomb, a place where meticulous order could be imposed on the chaotic leavings of the past. His current task, after cataloguing the surprisingly intact, if salt-flecked, sextants and barometers in the main storeroom, was to assess the contents of the keeper's cottage sitting room. It was a small, surprisingly cozy space, despite the chill that no amount of coaxing from the sputtering electric heater could fully dispel. A threadbare armchair sagged by a cold hearth, its chintz faded to near monochrome. Bookshelves, bowed under the weight of tide-stained ledgers and yellowed novels, lined one wall. Dust lay thick as a shroud over everything, disturbed only by his own recent movements. Elias, a man who found solace in lists and the careful categorization of things, ran a gloved finger along the soot-stained oak mantelpiece. Generations of keepers must have warmed their hands here, staring into flames while the Atlantic raged outside. His fingers, seeking out the texture of the wood beneath the grime, brushed against something small and metallic. He leaned closer. Half hidden behind a chipped ceramic gull was a music box. It was no more than 6 inches long, its silver plate tarnished to a dull, pewter gray, intricate floral carvings almost obscured by oxidation and a sticky film of salt. Curious, despite himself, it wasn't on any initial inventory list he'd been given. He picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. A small, almost invisible clasp held the lid shut. With a flick of his thumbnail, he opened it. A melody unspooled into the quiet room, thin and tinny, yet possessed of a strange, heartbreaking beauty. It was a lullaby, slow and hesitant, with an unsettling cadence, as if the mechanism within was struggling, some notes catching, others sighing out with a fragile clarity. The tune was simple, repetitive, yet it tugged at something deep within him, a sense of profound, melancholic familiarity he couldn't place. He was certain he'd never heard it before, yet it resonated like a forgotten memory, a song from a dream just out of reach. The salt-stained lullaby, he thought, the phrase forming unbidden in his mind, apt for its origin and its sorrowful air. He let it play out, the final notes dwindling into the ever-present sigh of the wind around the cottage eaves. Elias, a man not given to whimsy, felt a prickle on his forearms. He closed the lid, the click unnaturally loud in the ensuing silence. He made a note on his pad, small, tarnished silver music box, floral design, plays unidentified lullaby. Mantelpiece, sitting room. He'd investigate its provenance later. For now, it was just another artifact. He placed it carefully back behind the gull, the brief, unsettling interlude already receding as he turned his attention to a stack of brittle charts. The rest of the day passed in a blur of methodical work. He catalogued tide tables, correspondence, mostly official, relating to supplies and weather reports, and a collection of surprisingly well-preserved photographs of stern-faced men in keepers' uniforms, their wives often standing slightly behind them, faces unreadable. The generator, housed in a small outbuilding, grumbled its diesel-scented rhythm, a counterpoint to the relentless percussion of waves against the cliffs below. As dusk bled into a starless, turbulent night, Elias settled in the cottage's small kitchen with a ration-packed meal and a book on lighthouse engineering. The wind shrieked a little louder now, rattling the window frames, a constant, mournful chorus. He was reading about the intricacies of Fresnel lenses, his mind pleasantly absorbed, when he first heard it. A faint thread of sound, so delicate it was almost lost beneath the wind's roar and the generator's thrum. He paused, head tilted, listening. There it was again. Clearer this time. The lullaby. The same slow, broken notes he'd heard from the music box. His blood ran cold. He sat bolt upright, the book sliding from his lap. The music box was in the sitting room, its lid firmly closed. He hadn't touched it since that afternoon. He strained his ears. The sound was thin, ethereal, undeniably the same tune, but it wasn't coming from the sitting room. It was, outside. Faint, yet chillingly distinct, it seemed to drift on the wind, weaving through the storm's cacophony. Elias swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. He told himself it was the wind. The wind played tricks in places like this. The old boatman, Silas, had even said something about the old songs the wind sings. It was a common phenomenon, acoustic pareidolia, the mind finding patterns in random noise. It had to be. But the melody was too specific, too identical to the music box. He pushed himself up from the table, his heart thudding against his ribs with a force that surprised him. He had to be sure. He walked into the sitting room, his footsteps echoing on the bare floorboards. The music box sat inert on the mantel, exactly where he'd left it. He picked it up, half expecting it to be warm, or vibrating. It was cold, silent. He returned to the kitchen. The lullaby was still there, a ghostly whisper threading its way through the gale. And then, with a dreadful clarity, he realized its direction. It was coming from the lighthouse. His pragmatic mind reeled, searching for logical explanations. A bird with a peculiar song. Unlikely, not this tune. Someone else on the headland. Impossible. Silas had been adamant, no one came out here, especially not in this weather. The nearest village was miles away, the path treacherous even in daylight. A shiver, independent of the cottage's pervasive chill, traced its way down his spine. He was an archivist, a man of facts and tangible evidence. Ghosts and phantom melodies were the stuff of cheap novels, not his carefully ordered reality. Yet, the music persisted, a delicate, sorrowful invitation from the dark tower. He had to know. Grabbing his heavy-duty flashlight from the hook by the door and pulling on his weatherproof jacket, Elias stepped out into the narrow, covered walkway that connected the cottage to the lighthouse. The wind howled through the gaps in the stonework, trying to tear the breath from his lungs, whipping icy rain into his face. The short 10-yard passage felt like a gauntlet. He reached the heavy iron door of the lighthouse tower. The music, he thought, seemed fainter here, almost swallowed by the storm and the stone. Or had it stopped? He pushed the door inward. It groaned in protest, the sound echoing up into the unseen heights of the tower. Cold, damp air, thick with the smell of rust, old brine, and something else, a faint, metallic tang he couldn't quite place, enveloped him. He shone his flashlight beam upwards. It cut a swathe through the oppressive darkness, illuminating the spiraling iron staircase, the damp-streaked curved walls, disappearing into the gloom above. Silence. The lullaby was gone. Only the wind moaned around the stone structure, a hollow, desolate sound. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding small, foolish. It was absorbed by the stone, by the sheer emptiness. He listened, every nerve ending tingling. Nothing. He began to climb, his boots ringing on the iron treads. Each step seemed to amplify the silence. The rhythmic pulse of the long-extinguished lamp, he almost fancied he could hear it, a phantom heartbeat in the stone, but it was just the thumping in his own chest, the echo of his unease. He checked the first few landings, small circular platforms with narrow, salt-caked windows. Dust lay undisturbed. Cobwebs, thick as funeral shrouds, adorned every corner. There was no sign of entry, no source for any sound other than the elements. He continued upward, towards the lamp room. The air grew colder, the metallic scent stronger. The climb was dizzying, the spiral seeming to tighten around him. Finally, he reached the lamp room. The great Fresnel lens assembly stood silent and dark, its intricate glass panels cracked and dull. The mechanism that once turned it was frozen, a mass of corroded iron. Dust motes danced in his flashlight beam. There was nowhere for anyone, or anything, to hide. No place a music box could be, let alone one that played itself. The lullaby was definitively gone. He stood there for a long moment, the wind buffeting the thick glass of the lantern housing, making it hum like a monstrous tuning fork. Had he imagined it? Had the isolation, the relentless moan of the wind, finally started to fray the edges of his composure? It was the most logical explanation. Stress, solitude, an overactive imagination stimulated by an unfamiliar, mournful tune heard earlier in the day. Yet, as he descended the spiraling stairs, the flashlight beam jiggling, a sliver of doubt remained, cold and sharp. The clarity of the melody, its persistence over the sounds of the storm, the distinct sense of its origin within the tower. Back in the relative warmth of the cottage, he triple-checked the windows and doors, a new, unwelcome prickle of anxiety running beneath his skin. The generator still rumbled its monotonous song, a reassuringly solid sound. He tried to return to his book, but the words swam before his eyes. The broken notes of the lullaby echoed in his mind, no longer just a curious artifact, but a question mark etched into the silence of Porthgero light. Sleep, when it finally came, was shallow and troubled, filled with indistinct images of swirling mist, the glint of tarnished silver, and the faint, heartbreaking strains of a song he knew he shouldn't know. The salt-stained lullabies of Porthgero, it seemed, were just beginning to make themselves heard. And Elias Vance, the pragmatic archivist, felt the first, terrifying tremor of an ordered world beginning to tilt. The day had bled into a long, gray evening, the sun surrendering the sky to a bruise-purple twilight that pressed against the cottage windows. Elias Vance, hunched over the wide oak table in the keeper's living room, felt the familiar ache in his shoulders, the satisfying burn in his eyes from hours spent deciphering the faded ink of Porthgero's shipping logs. The rhythmic scratch of his pen as he cross-referenced entries in his own notebook was a small, dry counterpoint to the ceaseless moan of the wind around the eaves and the distant, percussive boom of waves against the headland. He was making progress, albeit slow. The records from the late 19th and early 20th centuries were mostly intact, detailing coal deliveries, supply runs, inspections, and the monotonous, vital duty of the light. Thomas Ashton, Keeper, 1903-. The question mark was his own addition. Ashton's entries, initially as meticulous as Elias's own work, grew sparse, then erratic, around 1908. Elias had a growing sense of unease about Thomas Ashton, a name that seemed to snag in the back of his mind more than the others. With a sigh, he capped his fountain pen and stretched, his vertebrae cracking a series of small reports in the quiet room. The generator outside gave a rheumatic grumble, a reminder of its fickle temperament. He'd need to check the fuel before turning in. Supper had been a utilitarian affair of tinned soup and stale bread hours ago. Now, a cup of tea was in order before the final tasks of the night. He pushed back his chair, the sound loud in the stillness, and walked through the short, connecting passage that led to the kitchen. This passage, a stone umbilical cord to the towering lighthouse, always felt colder, the air within it tasting sharply of salt and something else, something ancient and metallic he couldn't quite place. the exhalation of the tower itself. The kitchen was small, functional, retaining the scent of decades of simple meals cooked on the old Rayburn stove, now cold and silent. A single, bare bulb hanging from a frayed flex cast a stark, yellowish light, making the shadows in the corners dance. Elias flicked the kettle switch, a modern concession, thankfully, and reached for a mug from the draining board. And then he saw it. Just inside the back door, which led out to a small, unsheltered patch of ground before the cliff edge, was a footprint. A single, small, perfect footprint. It was shockingly clear on the dark, worn wooden floorboards, the outline of a child's bare foot, toes splayed, heel distinct. And it was wet. Not just damp, but glistening, as if someone had stepped from a puddle and placed their foot down with deliberate care. Elias froze, the mug halfway to the counter. His heart gave a sudden, hard thump against his ribs. He listened. The wind whined, the sea roared, the generator coughed. Nothing else. No scurrying, no childish giggle, no sigh of a door closing. His mind, trained for logic and order, scrambled for an explanation. A leak? He glanced up. The ceiling was stained, yes, but dry, no fresh drips apparent. Rain. He'd been engrossed in his work, but he was sure it hadn't rained since the brief shower that morning. He moved cautiously towards the back door, his gaze fixed on the impossible print. The door was bolted. Firmly. From the inside. He'd shot the heavy iron bolt himself after bringing in the last of the kindling that afternoon. He remembered the satisfying thud it made. He crouched, careful not to disturb the print. It was undeniably a child's. Small, no more than 6 inches long. The water that formed it was clear. Not muddy. He reached out a tentative finger, hesitating just above the glistening surface. If he touched it, and it was real, what then? If he touched it and it wasn't real, what then? He forced himself to stand, to think. He walked to the small kitchen window, peering out into the gathering gloom. The ground outside, a patch of hardy, salt-resistant grass and bare earth, was dry. He could see the faint sheen of old moisture from the morning's shower, but nothing fresh, nothing that could account for a soaked foot. And even if it were raining, how had it gotten inside a bolted door? Could it be condensation? Some freak atmospheric condition within the old cottage? He was an archivist, not a physicist, but it seemed ludicrous. The print was too defined, too clearly anatomical. A wave of dizziness washed over him. He gripped the edge of the counter. He was tired, yes. Isolated. The work was demanding. But he wasn't prone to flights of fancy. He prided himself on his pragmatism. This was not pragmatic. He looked back at the footprint. It seemed to mock him from the floorboards, a tiny, irrefutable anomaly in his carefully structured world. He considered wiping it up, erasing the evidence of, what? His own fraying sanity. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. It was a clue, though to what, he didn't know. The kettle clicked off, its cheerful sound an absurd intrusion. He made his tea automatically, his movements stiff, his mind racing. He didn't go back into the living room. The thought of the dimly lit space, filled with the unseen weight of other people's lives, suddenly felt oppressive. He sat at the small kitchen table, his back to the wall, the footprint in his line of sight. He drank the tea, but it tasted of nothing. The wind seemed to pick up, rattling the window panes, its voice no longer a mournful sigh but something more insistent, carrying snatches of sound that almost resolved into something. Whispers. Music. He shook his head, trying to clear it. It was just the wind. It had to be. Finally, the cold of the kitchen began to seep into his bones. He knew he couldn't sit there all night. With a deep breath, he stood, rinsed his mug, and decided to brave the journey to his bedroom. He left the footprint. Let it be there in the morning. Let the pale light of dawn prove it a trick of the shadows, a figment of an overtired imagination. His bedroom was at the far end of the cottage, small and Spartan, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a single window that looked out onto the churning sea. The generator still chugged unevenly, providing power for the single lamp on his nightstand. He checked its fuel earlier, a small act of normalcy that now felt like a distant memory. He undressed quickly, the chill of the room clinging to his skin. The sheets felt cold, slightly damp, as they always did in Porthgaro. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. The lighthouse tower, though its lamp was long dead, still seemed to possess a presence. Sometimes, he thought he could feel a faint, rhythmic thrum through the very stone of the cottage, the ghost of its great turning mechanism. Tonight, that imagined pulse felt stronger, like a slow, deep heartbeat. The wind was a constant tormentor, prying at the ill-fitting window frame, breathing secrets against the glass. He tried to focus on the sound of the waves, usually a comfort, a vast, impersonal rhythm. But tonight, every creak of the old cottage, every skittering sound from the roof, every sigh of the wind, seemed freighted with intent. He must have drifted off, a shallow, uneasy doze, because he found himself jerked awake by a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. The air felt colder, heavier. The rhythmic pulse he often imagined from the tower was no longer a distant thrum, it felt closer, almost inside him, a dull, internal beat. He lay perfectly still, his senses straining in the darkness. The generator outside had fallen into one of its quieter spells, and the silence it left behind was profound, broken only by the wind. And then, it came. A whisper, soft as a moth's wing, so faint he almost dismissed it as another trick of the wind pressing against the ancient stone walls. It was close, seeming to emanate from the wall beside his bed, the wall shared with the silent, shadowed bulk of the house. "Do you remember me?" The voice was light, sexless, like a child's, yet old, impossibly old, freighted with a sorrow that seemed to leach the warmth from the air. It wasn't accusatory, not threatening, but filled with a desperate, poignant longing. Elias's breath caught in his throat. His blood turned to ice water. Every nerve ending screamed. This was no draft, no trick of acoustics. This was a voice, inches away, speaking words. He didn't move. He couldn't. Terror, stark and absolute, held him rigid. He squeezed his eyes shut, as if not seeing could somehow negate what he'd heard. But the words echoed in the sudden, ringing silence of his mind, clear and undeniable. "Do you remember me?" The question hung in the chilled air of the small bedroom, a fragile, salt-stained plea from a past that refused to stay buried, a past that had just left a single, wet footprint on his kitchen floor. And Elias Vance, the meticulous archivist, knew with a certainty that chilled him deeper than any Cornish wind, that his careful cataloguing of Porthgaro's history was about to become a terrifyingly personal endeavor. The silence that followed was worse than the whisper, pregnant with an unseen, unheard presence that was now, undeniably, aware of him. He was no longer just an observer of Porthgaro's secrets, he was becoming part of them. The salt-stained lullabies of Porthgaro Light. Part 1, The Weight of Tides and Time. Elias Vance prided himself on his immunity to suggestion. 42 years of sifting through the detritus of lives lived and lost, of cataloguing the prosaic and the profound, had instilled in him a pragmatism as solid as the granite cliffs of Porthgaro. He believed in facts, in tangible evidence, in the comforting order of a well-maintained archive. Ghosts, to him, were merely unfiled memories, emotional residue best left to poets and folklorists. This assignment, however, tested the edges of that pragmatism. Porthgaro Lighthouse, a lonely sentinel on the Cornish coast, had been silent for nearly half a century, its great lamp extinguished, its purpose rendered obsolete by modern navigation. His task was to decommission its intellectual property, so to speak, to sort, catalogue, and prepare for removal the contents of the tower and the adjacent keeper's cottage. A 3-week stint, utterly isolated, a prospect that, after the quiet implosion of his marriage and a subsequent, bruising departmental review, felt more like a balm than a burden. The boatman, a wiry Cornish man named Silas Jory with eyes the color of a stormy sea, had been laconic during the choppy journey from Port Isaac. As Elias's meager supplies and numerous archive boxes were offloaded onto the slippery, seaweed-strewn jetty at the base of the headland, Jory had paused, his gaze fixed on the brooding silhouette of the lighthouse against the bruised twilight sky. "She's a hungry old girl, Porthgarrow," he'd rumbled, the words almost lost to the wind that clawed at their coats. "Listens more than she speaks these days. But you mind the old songs the wind sings up here? They ain't always just the wind." He'd spat into the churning water. "Be back for ye, 3 weeks. Weather permitting, mind." And with a curt nod, he'd been gone, the chug of his boat's engine quickly swallowed by the roar of the surf. Elias had watched him go, a familiar knot of self-reliance tightening in his chest. He'd managed far more complex sights, albeit usually with better phone signal and less dramatic scenery. The warnings of locals were, in his experience, part of the regional charm easily filed under folklore, local color. The first few days passed in a blur of methodical activity. The keeper's cottage, connected to the tower by a short, stone-flagged covered walkway, was a time capsule. Dust lay thick as fallen snow on furniture draped in yellowed sheets. Salt-warped books lined the shelves, their pages stiff and brittle. Maritime charts, curled at the edges, depicted a coastline both familiar and subtly alien. The previous occupants, it seemed, had simply walked away, leaving mugs on the draining board and a half-finished game of draughts on a small table. Elias set up his workstation in the small parlor, the grumbling diesel generator outside providing intermittent, sputtering power for his laptop and a single bare bulb. The wind was a constant presence, a mournful sigh that rattled the window panes and seeped through ancient cracks in the stonework, carrying with it the taste of salt and the faint, unsettling metallic tang he'd come to associate with the tower itself. He began with the official documents, shipping logs meticulously detailing arrivals and departures, their ink faded but still legible, maintenance records charting the endless battle against rust and erosion, and the weather journals, thick, leather-bound volumes filled with observations of wind speed, barometric pressure, and sea conditions. It was in these weather journals, on the 4th day, that the first tremor of unease shook his carefully constructed composure. Part 2, Echoes in the Logbook. The logbooks were remarkably complete, dating back to the lighthouse's commissioning in 1888. He was currently focused on the early 20th century, cross-referencing entries with personnel files to build a picture of the keepers who had manned this isolated post. The entries were typically terse: SW Gale, Force 9. Seas high. Lamp burning bright. Or, fog dense. Horn sounded at 0400. All well. On Tuesday, Elias had spent several hours poring over the entries for the years 1910 to 1912, the tenure of a keeper named Thomas Penrose. The script was a neat, slightly backward-slanting copperplate. No mention of family, just the relentless cataloging of the elements. He'd made his own notes, logged the volume, and moved on. Wednesday morning dawned gray and oppressive, the sea a churning slate mirror reflecting the sky's ill temper. The generator, after a particularly violent coughing fit, had died, plunging the cottage into a gloomy twilight. Elias, working by the flickering light of a gas lantern, decided to re-examine Penrose's logbooks, a nagging feeling that he'd missed something subtle pricking at him. He found the relevant volume, its pages smelling faintly of brine and old paper. He turned to the entries for 1911, his gaze scanning the familiar script. And then he saw them. Faintly scribbled in the margins of several entries, in a spidery, almost desperate hand entirely different from Penrose's neat copperplate, were 2 names, Ilara and, more frequently, Lily. They weren't integrated into the official entries, but clung to the edges, like whispered secrets. He ran a finger over one. The ink was slightly faded, a different hue to Penrose's, as if added later, by someone else, or by Penrose himself in a markedly different state of mind. Elias frowned. He hadn't noticed these yesterday. He was sure he hadn't. His methodology was rigorous, he scanned every inch of a document. Had the poor light yesterday obscured them? Perhaps. But it felt, Wrong. A shiver, cold and unwelcome, traced its way down his spine, unrelated to the damp chill of the cottage. He meticulously photographed the pages with his digital camera, the flash momentarily banishing the shadows and highlighting the faint, intrusive script. He made a note, anomalous marginalia. Recheck initial assessment of Penrose's solo posting. Perhaps Penrose had a family here after all, unrecorded in the official personnel files, a common enough occurrence in those days for auxiliary family help. The wind howled outside, a keening sound that seemed to mimic a human cry. Elias tried to dismiss the unsettling feeling, attributing it to the isolation, the poor light, the incessant noise. He was a man of logic. There would be an explanation. He continued to turn the pages, his unease growing. The marginalia became more frequent, more erratic, around the winter of 1911. Then, towards the end of January 1912, he found an entry that made the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. Penrose's usual meticulous script detailed a fierce storm, force 10 winds, and monstrous waves breaking over the lantern gallery itself. But beneath it, crammed into the small space at the bottom of the page, in that same spidery, desperate hand, was a sentence that didn't belong. Lily doesn't cry when the lullaby plays. Don't forget, Elias. Elias stared at the page, his blood turning to ice water. Elias. His name. Written in a century-old logbook. His breath hitched. He reread the sentence, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Lily doesn't cry when the lullaby plays. Don't forget, Elias. He slammed the book shut, a cloud of ancient dust erupting into the stale air. This was impossible. A prank? But who could have done it? Jory. Highly unlikely. The man had barely spoken 2 words to him. And how would he know his name, beyond the formal introduction? It wasn't as if he'd left his personal correspondence lying about. He snatched up his own notebook, his handwriting suddenly looking foreign and shaky. He hadn't written that. He knew he hadn't. He would remember writing his own name in such a bizarre context. Or, would he? A sliver of doubt, cold and sharp, pierced through his shock. The isolation. The relentless, disorienting sound of the wind and sea. The flickering, unreliable light. Was it possible he was more tired, more stressed, than he'd admitted to himself? Could he have, in a moment of distraction or exhaustion, scribbled that nonsensical note, perhaps conflating his own name with some detail he'd read? The thought was deeply disturbing. Elias prided himself on his mental acuity, his meticulous attention to detail. The idea that his own mind could be playing such tricks on him was, in its own way, more frightening than any supernatural explanation. He forced himself to breathe, to think rationally. He opened the logbook again, his hand trembling slightly. The entry was still there, the ink undeniably old, faded, consistent with the other marginalia. It hadn't been written in his pen, with his ink. The script was nothing like his own careful, modern lettering. He remembered a faint sound he'd been hearing intermittently over the past few days, almost subliminal, woven into the fabric of the wind's moan. A thin, repetitive musical phrase. A melody so faint he dismissed it as an auditory illusion, the kind of phantom noise one hears in profound silence or overwhelming cacophony. A lullaby. The word now seemed to scream from the page. He spent the rest of the day in a state of heightened anxiety, jumping at every creak of the cottage, every intensified gust of wind. He tried to work on other documents, sorting through bundles of yellowed letters tied with faded ribbon, but his concentration was shattered. The words in the logbook replayed in his mind, a chilling loop. Don't forget, Elias. Forget what? That evening, as a wild, rain-lashed darkness enveloped Porthcarroll, Elias found himself listening, truly listening, to the wind. And this time, he was almost certain he could discern it, a fragile, mournful tune, like a broken music box, threading its way through the storm's fury. The salt-stained lullaby. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he hadn't written that entry. Porthgero was remembering for him. Or perhaps it was trying to make him remember something he'd never known. Part 3, The Whispering Walls. The discovery in the logbook became a fissure in Elias's carefully constructed reality, a crack through which the uncanny began to seep. His sleep, previously deep and untroubled by the storm-racked nights, became a landscape of disjointed images and unsettling emotions. He dreamt of water, vast and dark, and of a child's small hand slipping from his grasp. He would wake with a gasp, his heart pounding, the phantom scent of lavender and brine thick in his nostrils. Lavender, he'd noticed a dried, faded sprig of it pressed between the pages of a poetry book in the parlor, a book inscribed with the name Ilara Penrose. He tried to rationalize. The dreams were stress-induced, products of his subconscious grappling with the logbook entry and the names he'd found. The smells. The cottage was old, it held the olfactory ghosts of generations. Logical. Plausible. Yet, the explanations felt thin, like worn fabric straining against an unseen pressure. The subtle phenomena began to escalate. No longer content to hover at the edges of his perception. One morning, he found the small, carved wooden toy boat he'd catalogued the day before, noting its position on a high shelf in the kitchen, sitting squarely in the center of the parlor table, a tiny puddle of fresh seawater pooling beneath it. The floorboards around it were dry. He knew he hadn't moved it. He lived by a system: objects, once catalogued, were not touched again unless strictly necessary. Cold spots became more pronounced, migrating through the cottage with no discernible pattern. He'd be reading at his desk, a relative warmth provided by his thick jumper and the memory of the generator's brief efforts, when a pocket of air would chill him to the bone, raising gooseflesh on his arms. It would linger for a moment, then dissipate, leaving him shivering and unnerved. The whispers were the worst. Before, they had been amorphous, easily mistaken for the sibilance of the wind through the ill-fitting window frames or the rush of waves on the rocks below. Now, they seemed to coalesce, to brush against intelligibility. Standing by the walkway to the tower, the wind tearing at him, he'd hear a soft sigh that almost formed a word: cold, or lost. Once, distinctly, he heard a child's giggle, cut short, seemingly from the direction of the tower itself. He'd spun around, his flashlight beam dancing over the empty, dripping stones. Nothing. Only the wind, mocking him. The rhythmic, phantom creak of the lighthouse lamp mechanism, which he'd initially dismissed as the groaning of the old tower settling, became more insistent. He'd hear it even in the cottage, a slow, ponderous thrum creak, like a giant, metallic heartbeat. He knew the mechanism was frozen, its gears seized by decades of rust and neglect. He'd inspected it himself on his first day. Yet, the sound persisted, an auditory hallucination he couldn't shake, sometimes so vivid it seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. He clung to his work, his only anchor in the rising tide of unease. He began to focus on the personal effects of the Penrose family, drawn to them by an invisible current. He found a small, leather-bound diary, its clasp rusted shut. After a careful struggle, he prized it open. The handwriting matched the copperplate in the weather logbooks: Thomas Penrose. The early entries were mundane: observations about the light, requests for supplies, notes on repairs. Then, Ilara appeared in the narrative, her arrival bringing a brief flowering of warmth to the stark prose. Ilara makes this rock feel like a home. Her laughter is a brighter light than the lamp. Soon after, Lily was born, and the entries softened further, filled with a father's quiet joy. Lily has Ilara's eyes. She sleeps soundly, even when the gales blow. A true lighthouse keeper's daughter. As Elias read, he felt a profound sense of intrusion, yet he couldn't stop. He was piecing together a life, a family, that had existed in this very space, breathed this same salt-laced air. He found pressed flowers, sea pinks and thrift, tucked between pages describing Lily's first steps, her first words. He found a tattered woman's shawl, tucked away in a sea chest, that still carried the faintest scent of lavender and seawater. When he touched it, an inexplicable wave of sorrow washed over him, so potent it brought tears to his eyes. The diary entries, like the weather logbooks, began to change around the autumn of 1911. The tone grew more strained. Mentions of Elara became less frequent, tinged with worry. Elara is quiet. Stares out at the sea for hours. The isolation weighs heavily on her. Then, more ominously, she sings to Lily constantly. Strange, sad little songs I do not know. Says the wind teaches them to her. The lullaby. Elias felt a jolt. He cross-referenced the dates. The mentions of Elara's strange, sad little songs coincided with the first appearances of the names Elara and Lily in the margins of the weather logbook. The spidery, desperate hand, was it Elara's? Or was it Thomas, transcribing his fear, his descent into a shared anxiety? One afternoon, driven by a compulsion he didn't understand, Elias ventured into the lighthouse tower itself. The air inside was frigid, heavy with the smell of rust, damp stone, and that faint, lingering metallic odor that always unsettled him. He climbed the spiraling iron staircase, his footsteps echoing unervingly in the confined space. The wind shrieked through the cracked panes of the lantern room, a symphony of desolation. He stood before the massive, inert lamp mechanism, its intricate lenses cloudy and fractured. The great Fresnel lens, designed to throw light for 20 nautical miles, was a monument to forgotten technology. As he stared at it, the phantom thrum creak filled his ears, louder here, as if the machine itself was trying to draw breath. He noticed something wedged between two of the larger prisms of the lens. A small, dark object. With cautious fingers, he worked it free. It was a child's drawing, sketched on a piece of rough paper, folded multiple times. He carefully unfolded it. The drawing was crude, rendered in charcoal. It depicted the lighthouse, tall and stark. But in the lantern room, where the light should be, there was a swirling black vortex. And standing at the base of the tower was a small stick figure, Lily, he presumed, looking up. Beside the tower, another, larger figure was sketched, but it was shadowy, indistinct, more of a smudge than a person, its features obscured. He turned the drawing over. On the back, in a child's clumsy printing, was one word, quiet. A gust of wind slammed against the lantern glass, making him jump. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to leave the tower, a feeling of being watched, of trespassing in a place of immense sorrow. He hurried back down the winding stairs, the child's drawing clutched in his hand, the phantom creaking of the lamp seeming to chase him. Back in the relative sanctuary of the cottage, the generator chose that moment to roar defiantly back to life, flooding the parlor with harsh, electric light. Elias blinked, disoriented. For a moment, the world felt normal, solid. Then he looked at the drawing again, and the oppressive atmosphere of Porthgero settled back over him, heavy and suffocating. He began to talk to himself, a habit he'd always disdained. It's the isolation, Vance. Stress. Lack of sleep. He'd make a pot of strong tea, focus on the concrete, the verifiable. But even as he measured tea leaves into the pot, he saw, from the corner of his eye, a flicker of movement near the window. He turned. Nothing. Just the rain-streaked glass reflecting the dim interior. But then he noticed it. On the dusty windowsill, almost invisible against the gray stone, was a set of tiny, wet handprints. Child-sized. Perfectly formed. As if someone, or something, small and drenched, had recently pressed their hands there, looking in. Elias backed away, a choked sound escaping his lips. The tea forgotten, he sank into his chair, the drawing falling from his numb fingers. The rational explanations were crumbling, eroding like the cliffs outside under the relentless assault of the sea. Porthgero wasn't just a collection of stone and timber, of old records and forgotten lives. It was a vessel, and it was full. Full of echoes, of sorrow, and of a story that was clawing its way into the present, piece by painstaking piece, demanding to be heard, to be seen, to be felt. And it seemed to have chosen Elias as its unwilling audience, its reluctant participant. The wind howled, and through it, faint but undeniable, threaded the mournful, salt-stained lullaby. And Elias knew, with a terrifying certainty, that the performance had only just begun. Part 4, The Shifting Sands of Sanity. Days bled into a single, gray continuum, marked only by the reluctant dawn and the swift, smothering dusk. Elias's meticulous routines fractured. Cataloging became a secondary concern, eclipsed by a consuming, fearful obsession with the Penrose family and the increasingly assertive phenomena that plagued Porthcawl. He felt caught in a rip current, tugged further and further from the shores of his own certainty. The archives themselves seemed to mock his efforts at order. One morning, he opened Thomas Penrose's diary to a page he distinctly remembered being filled with mundane observations about migrating seabirds. Now, it was covered in frantic, almost illegible scrawls. "She won't stop singing. The child is too quiet. The light is wrong." The ink looked fresh, glistening wetly in the lantern light, though it should have been dry for a century. When he reached out a trembling finger to touch it, it came away clean. He blinked, looked again, and the page was as he remembered it, seabird observations, faded ink. Had he imagined it? A waking dream? He started keeping a parallel log, a desperate attempt to document his own experiences, to anchor himself. 9:17, heard distinct humming, female, source indeterminate. Matches melody fragment from wind. Lullaby. Or 14:30, found muddy footprint, child-sized, by scullery door. Measured. Approximate, size 4. No mud on my boots. Floor was clean an hour ago. The entries grew more erratic, mirroring the disintegration of his composure. Am I losing my mind? Is this what happened to Thomas? To Alara? His own past began to bleed into the present in disturbing ways. He found a photograph of his ex-wife, Sarah, a photo he was certain was tucked away in a box in his London flat, lying on his pillow one morning. There was no explanation for its presence. Later that day, while searching for a specific shipping manifest, he found, nestled between its pages, a small, silver locket he'd given his younger sister before she'd passed away from pneumonia years ago. A locket he believed lost. Holding it, a wave of grief, sharp and fresh as the day she died, overwhelmed him. It felt as if Porthcawl was rifling through his soul, using his own sorrows as a key. The lullaby motif grew more pervasive. It wasn't just in the wind anymore. He'd hear it hum softly, just beyond the range of clear hearing, when he was trying to concentrate. Sometimes, it seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. One evening, as the generator sputtered and died, plunging him into an abrupt, consuming darkness, he heard it clearly, a faint, tinny melody, unmistakably the lullaby, playing from the direction of the parlor. He fumbled for his flashlight, his heart hammering. The beam illuminated the room, empty save for the dust-sheeted furniture. Then he saw it. A small, tarnished music box, previously unseen, sat on the mantelpiece, its lid slightly ajar. As he watched, the melody tinkled to a halt. He hadn't put it there. He'd dusted that mantelpiece himself. The weather, always a brooding character on this coast, worsened dramatically. A ferocious late autumn storm descended, imprisoning Elias completely. For 3 days, wind and rain battered Porthcawl with demonic fury. Waves exploded against the cliffs, sending plumes of spray high over the lighthouse tower itself. The treacherous coastal path became an impassable torrent of mud and rockfall. The idea of Jory returning in such conditions was laughable. Elias was utterly, terrifyingly alone. During the height of the storm, the generator gave its final, shuddering gasp and fell silent for good. He was plunged into a primal darkness, relieved only by the weak beam of his flashlight and a dwindling supply of candles. The sounds of the storm were deafening, a chaotic orchestra of shrieking wind, booming waves, and the groaning agony of the old structures. And woven through it all, the lullaby, sometimes a fragile thread, sometimes a keening wail, amplified by the tempest. His dreams became intolerable. He no longer dreamt his own anxieties, but lived fragmented moments of the Penroses' lives. He saw through Thomas's eyes, staring out at a boiling sea, his heart heavy with a nameless dread. He felt Alara's despair as she rocked a silent lily, humming the endless, mournful tune. He saw the lantern room, not as it was now, but as it was then, the great lamp turning, casting its sweeping beam, but something was wrong, a flicker, a dimness, a growing shadow within the light itself. He would wake up shouting, tangled in his damp bedding, the taste of salt on his lips, unsure of who or where he was. He found more distressing items. A child's once white dress, now tattered and stained with what looked like rust and seawater, tucked beneath a loose floorboard in Lily's presumed room. A single, child-sized leather boot, stiff and misshapen, lying half-hidden in the tall grass near the cliff edge, as if lost in a hurried flight. Each discovery was a fresh stab of grief, a deepening of the mystery. The presence, or presences, seemed to be guiding him, drawing him towards the truth with a desperate, sorrowful insistence. One night, unable to sleep, he was drawn to the covered walkway. The storm still raged, but there was a momentary lull in the wind's ferocity. As he stood there, peering into the tumultuous darkness, he saw a faint, flickering light in the lantern room of the tower. Not the powerful, sweeping beam of the lamp, but a small, unsteady glow, like a candle. His heart leaped into his throat. No one could be up there. He was alone. Gripping his flashlight, its beam pitifully weak against the vastness of the night, he forced himself towards the tower. The door groaned open on protesting hinges. The air inside was colder than ever, the metallic scent overwhelming. "Hello?" he called, his voice thin and reedy. Only the howl of the wind through the broken glass answered. He began to climb the spiral stairs, each step an act of will. The phantom creaking of the lamp mechanism seemed to keep pace with his ascent. As he neared the top, he could hear it more clearly, a soft, rhythmic sobbing. He reached the lantern room. It was empty. The flickering light he'd seen from below was gone. But the sobbing was real, coming from the far side of the great lens assembly. He shone his flashlight. There, huddled against the cold iron, was the indistinct shape of a woman, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking. He could see no features, just a silhouette against the storm-lashed glass. As he watched, paralyzed, the figure slowly raised its head. He still couldn't make out a face, only a profound sense of despair that radiated from it like a physical blow. The sobbing intensified, then, with a sound like a drawn-out sigh, the figure seemed to dissolve, to melt back into the shadows and the swirling rain outside. Elias stumbled back, his hand flying to his mouth to stifle a cry. He had seen Alara. Or her echo. Her sorrow. He fled the tower, his flashlight beam bobbing erratically, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't stop until he was back in the cottage, the door bolted, a chair wedged under the handle, a futile gesture against an enemy that knew no locks. He collapsed at his makeshift desk, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold a pen. He found himself staring at his own reflection in the dark windowpane. Gaunt, wild-eyed, his hair matted. He looked like a stranger. Then, his reflection flickered. For a horrifying instant, the face staring back was not his own, but a gaunt, bearded man with haunted eyes, Thomas Penrose. Elias cried out, recoiling from the window. He was not just observing the tragedy, he was becoming part of it. The lines were blurring. He scrabbled for his notebook, needing to write, to document, to prove to himself that he was still Elias Vance, archivist. But as his pen touched the paper, his hand began to move with a will of its own, forming words in a script he didn't recognize, the familiar, backward slanting copperplate of Thomas Penrose. The lamp. Must keep the lamp. Lily, she's afraid of the dark. Elias stared at the words, his own horror reflected in the frantic loops of Penrose's script. He snatched his hand away as if burned. He was losing himself, piece by piece, to the ghosts of Porthgaro. The salt-stained lullabies were no longer just sounds, they were the soundtrack to his own unraveling, and to a tragedy that was refusing to stay buried, demanding a final, terrible encore. And he, it seemed, was to be its unwilling conductor. Part 5. The heart of the mechanism. The incident with the automatic writing, the chilling superimposition of Thomas Penrose's consciousness onto his own, marked a turning point for Elias. The terror remained, a cold stone in his gut, but it was now alloyed with a grim, almost fatalistic determination. He was no longer simply cataloging a history, he was ensnared by it. The pragmatic archivist was all but gone, replaced by a man haunted, hunted, and desperate for an ending, any ending, to this suffocating narrative. He felt Porthgero drawing him towards a specific point, a hidden nexus of the tragedy. The clues were no longer subtle, a book falling open to a particular passage, a draft guiding him towards a certain room, the lullaby itself seeming to emanate from a specific direction. He began to notice that the child-sized, wet handprints, which appeared with increasing frequency, always seemed to lead away from the cottage and towards the lighthouse tower. The focus of the phenomena seemed to be narrowing, centering on the lighthouse lamp itself. The phantom creaking was almost constant now, a dull, rhythmic ache in his awareness. The dreams intensified, always culminating in the lantern room, Thomas, frantic, wrestling with the mechanism, Ilara, a ghostly presence, weeping by the glass, Lily, a small, silent observer, her eyes wide with a fear that mirrored Elias's own. One particularly brutal night, when the wind shrieked like a banshee and the rain hammered against the cottage as if trying to beat its way in, Elias found himself irresistibly drawn to the tower. He didn't fight it. He lit a fresh candle, its flame guttering wildly, and stepped out into the raging storm. The covered walkway offered little protection, wind and spray lashed him mercilessly. Inside the tower, the atmosphere was electric. The metallic scent was stronger than ever, almost acrid. The creaking of the lamp mechanism was deafening, no longer a phantom sound but a tangible, groaning reality, as if the immense machine were in its death throes, or perhaps, struggling to be reborn. As he ascended the spiral staircase, he noticed something new. Scratched into the thick dust and grime on the stone walls were crude drawings, like those a child might make. A lighthouse. A boat. A stick figure of a girl. And a recurring symbol, a spiral, turning inwards. The same spiral as the staircase, as the great Fresnel lens. He reached the lantern room. The storm outside was a maelstrom of blackness and churning white water, illuminated by stark flashes of lightning. In the brief, lurid glare, the cracked lenses and frozen gears of the lamp mechanism seemed like the bones of some ancient, rusted beast. And then he saw it. Not a spectral figure this time, but something tangible. Tucked into a recess beneath the main gear housing, a place almost impossible to see without being intimately familiar with the mechanism, was a small, tin box. It was rusted, salt-encrusted, almost a part of the machinery itself. His heart pounded. This was it. The core of the secret. With trembling, icy fingers, he worked the box free. It was heavier than it looked. He carried it back down the treacherous stairs, shielding his candle from the drafts that snaked through the tower. Back in the relative shelter of the cottage, he placed the tin box on the table. For a long moment, he simply stared at it, a profound sense of dread warring with an equally powerful compulsion to know. The clasp was rusted solid. He fetched a sturdy letter opener from his archiving kit and, with considerable effort, managed to pry the lid open. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like dried seaweed, lay several items. The first was a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird, a puffin, its painted beak faded. Lilies, undoubtedly. Beneath it, a bundle of letters, tied with a piece of string. The handwriting on the topmost envelope was Ilara's, addressed to a sister in Penzance. These letters were different from the official documents, they were raw, desperate, filled with her growing fear of the isolation, of Thomas's changing moods, and of something she couldn't name, a darkness she felt emanating from the lighthouse itself. The light, she wrote in one, it doesn't feel right anymore. It feels hungry. And Thomas, he barely sleeps. He just watches the lamp, listens to its turning. He says it speaks to him. Then Elias saw the final item, the one that lay at the very bottom of the box. It was another logbook, smaller and more crudely bound than the official weather journals. Its cover was stained and warped. He opened it. The script was Thomas Penrose's, but it was wild, sprawling, a stark contrast to his earlier neatness. This was not an official record. This was a confession. A chronicle of madness. He read, his blood running cold. Thomas, driven half-mad by the relentless solitude, the oppressive weight of responsibility, and perhaps something older, darker, inherent in Porthcawl itself, had become obsessed with the lamp. He believed it was failing, that its light was diminishing, that a shadow was growing within it. He wrote of strange whispers coming from the mechanism, of visions seen in the swirling prisms of the lens. He feared for Lily, for Elara, convinced that if the light failed, they would all be consumed by the darkness that pressed in from the sea. Elara, terrified by his deteriorating state, had tried to get him to leave, to seek help. She'd written to her sister, begging for intervention. But Thomas, in his paranoia, had intercepted the letters. He saw her pleas as betrayal. The final entries were almost incoherent, a torrent of fear and delusion. He wrote of Elara trying to silence the lamp, to steal its voice. He described a struggle in the lantern room during a terrible storm. She tried to stop it. The lullaby, she said it was a warning. But the lamp needs to turn. It must turn. Lily needs the light. She fell. The bird. Lily's bird, it went into the dark water. Elias's breath caught in his throat. An accident? Elara, falling from the lantern gallery in the storm. But the next lines hinted at something even more horrifying. She is quiet now. Lily too. They are with the sea. The sea understands. It sings their lullaby. But the lamp is still wrong. The shadow is still there. I had to make it pure again. The final entry was short, chillingly calm after the preceding frenzy. The light is clean now. But so quiet. So very quiet. They don't cry. Not when the true lullaby plays. The one the mechanism sings. I will join them in the quiet song. Don't forget, Elias. You must understand the silence. Elias stared at the logbook, his mind reeling. It wasn't just a tragedy, it was a murder-suicide. Thomas, in his madness, believing Elara was a threat to the light, had caused her death. And Lily? What had happened to Lily? Drowned? Or had Thomas, in his unhinged state, silenced her too, before taking his own life, perhaps by throwing himself from the tower? The official records Elias had seen simply stated, Keeper Penrose and family lost at sea during severe storm. A convenient, sanitizing explanation. The phrase, don't forget, Elias. You must understand the silence resonated with the earlier, impossible entry in the weather log. It was Thomas, reaching out across the decades, his tormented consciousness somehow imprinted on this place, on the very fabric of Porthcawl. Suddenly, Elias understood the metallic tang he always smelled in the tower, the faint, unsettling scent that clung to the air. It wasn't just rust. It was old blood, absorbed into the stone, its memory lingering. He looked around the dim cottage, at the dusty relics of a life violently extinguished. The presence he'd felt wasn't just one entity, but three, their trauma inextricably bound together. Elara, trapped in her sorrow and her attempts to warn. Lily, a lost, frightened child. And Thomas, his guilt and madness echoing through time, desperate for his story to be understood, perhaps even for forgiveness, or at least, for an end to his tormented repetition. The wind outside seemed to soften for a moment, and in the lull, Elias heard the lullaby clearly. It wasn't just mournful anymore, it was profoundly, unbearably sad. The salt-stained lullabies of Porthcawl light were the songs of their unspeakable grief. He knew then what he had to do. What they wanted him to do. It wasn't about cataloging. It was about release. He had to complete something, as the initial prompt for his arrival, now a distant memory, had suggested. He had to understand the silence Thomas spoke of, and perhaps, break it. The final piece of the puzzle, Thomas's logbook implied, lay with the lamp itself, why it was really extinguished. Not by obsolescence, perhaps, but by something more. Or perhaps, it needed to be relit, one last time, to finally dispel the shadows Thomas had seen, the shadows that had consumed him. Elias picked up the small, carved puffin. Lily's bird. He looked towards the tower, a new, terrifying resolve hardening within him. The storm still raged, but Porthgero had one more secret to yield, and Elias Vance, the archivist who had sought refuge in order, was now an instrument of its chaotic, tragic past. The dawn was still hours away, but a different kind of light, a terrible understanding, was beginning to break. Part 6, The Last Broadcast. The revelation in Thomas Penrose's hidden logbook settled upon Elias not with the catharsis of discovery, but with the crushing weight of complicity. He was no longer an observer, he was the inheritor of a century-old madness, tasked with an act he didn't fully comprehend but felt compelled to attempt. You must understand the silence. What silence? The silence of the extinguished lamp? The silence of the grave? He looked at the contents of the tin box spread before him, Elara's desperate letters, Lily's puffin, Thomas's chronicle of despair. These were not mere artifacts, they were relics, imbued with the agony of their owners. The presences in the cottage felt different now, less accusatory, more expectant. The air was thick with a sorrowful anticipation. The lullaby, ever present, seemed to be calling him towards the tower, its melody now imbued with a desperate urgency. He knew he couldn't relight the great lamp in any conventional sense. The mechanism was shattered, the fuel lines long dead. But Thomas's final, lucid entry had spoken of the lamp being clean, but so quiet. Perhaps it wasn't about the physical light, but about acknowledging the truth, about bringing their story out of the suffocating darkness of the tower and into some form of remembrance. He gathered the items, Thomas's final logbook, Elara's letters, and Lily's small wooden puffin. He put on his oilskins, the candle flickering precariously as he moved. The storm had not abated, if anything, it had intensified, the wind a solid wall of sound and fury. The journey to the tower was a battle. Rain lashed his face like needles, and the wind threatened to tear him from the narrow walkway. When he finally wrestled open the tower door, the sounds within were terrifying. The groaning of the structure, the shrieking of the wind through the broken lantern glass, and overlaying it all, the deafening, rhythmic thrum creak of the lamp mechanism, now sounding like the tortured gasps of a dying giant. He ascended the spiral staircase, each step heavier than the last. The childish drawings on the wall, the lighthouse, the boat, the girl, the inward turning spirals, seemed to glow faintly in the candlelight, guiding him upwards. He could feel them, Thomas, Elara, Lily, their presence dense around him, not threatening, but overwhelmingly sad, their collective gaze fixed upon him. He reached the lantern room. It was a vortex of elemental chaos. Wind howled through the shattered panes, driving sheets of rain across the rusting iron floor. The massive Fresnel lens, cracked and dull, seemed to weep saltwater tears. The cold was bone-deep, and the metallic scent of old blood and despair was almost overpowering. He made his way to the central dais where the lamp mechanism stood, a monument to decay. The thrum creak was so loud here it was a physical vibration, shaking the very platform beneath his feet. He placed the candle in a sheltered niche, its flame struggling for life. Thomas, Elias said, his voice hoarse, barely audible above the storm. Elara. Lily. I know. I know what happened. He opened Thomas's last logbook. In the flickering, inadequate light, he began to read aloud, his voice gaining strength as he went. He read of Thomas's love for his family, his descent into paranoia, his obsession with the light. He read of Elara's fear, her desperate attempts to save them. He read of the struggle, the fall, the terrible silence that followed. As he read, the atmosphere in the lantern room shifted. The wind still howled, but the almost violent pressure of the presences seemed to lessen, replaced by an almost unbearable wave of sorrow. He felt Alara's grief as he read of her death, Thomas's uncomprehending despair, Lily's silent terror. Tears streamed down Elias's face, mingling with the rain that whipped in through the broken glass. He wasn't just reading, he was bearing witness, giving voice to their unspeakable tragedy. When he reached the final, chilling lines, "The light is clean now. But so quiet. Don't forget, Elias. You must understand the silence," his voice broke. He closed the logbook. The thrum creak of the mechanism seemed to falter, to slow. He then took out Alara's letters, reading excerpts aloud, her pleas for help, her love for her child, her growing dread. He held up Lily's small puffin. "Lily," he whispered, "your bird. You didn't lose it in the dark water. It's here." As he spoke these words, a profound stillness fell over the lantern room. The wind outside still raged, but within the confines of the glass and iron, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The phantom creaking of the lamp mechanism ceased. For the first time since he'd arrived at Porthgaro, there was a true, deep silence from the heart of the tower, a silence that felt not empty, but resolved. Elias stood there, trembling, exhausted, the candle flame now burning steady and bright in the sudden calm. He looked around. The feeling of being watched was gone. The oppressive sorrow had eased, replaced by a faint, lingering sadness, like the echo of a fading song. He didn't know how long he stood there. Eventually, the first, watery gray light of dawn began to seep through the storm clouds. The tempest was finally breaking. He carefully placed Thomas's logbook, Alara's letters, and Lily's puffin together on the rusted dais at the heart of the dormant lamp mechanism. He didn't know what else to do. These were their testaments. This was their grave marker. As he turned to leave, his gaze fell upon the great Fresnel lens. Where before it had been dull and lifeless, now, in the faint morning light, a single prism seemed to catch a stray ray, and for a fleeting instant, it refracted a tiny, brilliant spark of rainbow light, like a wink or a tear. He descended the tower for the last time. The air felt cleaner, lighter. The metallic scent was fainter, almost gone. The childlike drawings on the wall seemed faded, less urgent. Back in the cottage, he sank into his chair, utterly drained. The lullaby was gone. The whispers were silent. The cold spots had vanished. Porthgaro felt still. Just an old, empty lighthouse and its keeper's cottage on a storm-battered headland. 3 days later, under a bruised but clearing sky, Silas Jory's boat appeared on the horizon. He found Elias Vance sitting on the jetty, his archive boxes neatly stacked, his face etched with an exhaustion that went far beyond physical tiredness, but also a strange, quiet peace. Jory eyed him shrewdly. "Looks like she let you go, then," he observed, his voice neutral. "Sometimes she holds on tight. Seems the old songs have quieted some." Elias merely nodded, too weary to explain. He knew his official report would be factual, detailing the contents of the archive, the state of the structures. There would be no mention of ghostly lullabies, of shifting logbooks, of a tragedy replayed and finally laid to rest. Who would believe him? He barely believed it himself, now that the oppressive influence had lifted. But as the boat pulled away from Porthgaro, Elias looked back at the lighthouse. A stark silhouette against the morning sky. He knew what he had experienced was real. He had been a conduit, a catalyst. He had listened to the salt-stained lullabies, understood their sorrowful tune, and in doing so, had perhaps allowed the singers to finally fall silent. He would carry the weight of their story, the faint echo of their grief, for the rest of his days. He was an archivist, after all. And some archives, he now knew, were not written in ink on paper, but etched in salt and sorrow, on the very soul of a place, waiting for someone to finally read them. Porthgaro had been remembered, piece by piece, and in that remembrance, perhaps, found its peace. And Elias, in the quiet that followed, hoped he might eventually find his own. The Salt-Stained Lullabies of Porthgero Light. Chapter 1, The Boatman's Warning. The Sea Serpent, a squat, belligerent trawler that had clearly seen better decades, slammed into another wave, sending a plume of icy spray across the bow. Elias Vance tightened his grip on the wet railing, his knuckles white. He tasted salt, acrid and unyielding, and the diesel fumes from the laboring engine did little to mask the raw, primal scent of the Atlantic in a temper. Below his feet, the deckplate vibrated with a bone-jarring intensity that had become miserably familiar over the past hour. He was a man who preferred the hushed sanctity of archives, the subtle rustle of acid-free paper, the precise click of a cataloging system. This violent, elemental chaos, was an assault on his sensibilities. Yet, a small, stubbornly persistent part of him, the part that had devoured tales of maritime adventure in his youth, felt a grim sort of thrill. He'd accepted the Porthgero commission for its isolation, certainly, a balm after the quiet implosion of his last major project and the ensuing quiet. He'd also accepted it for the lure of history, the tangible connection to lives lived on the very edge of existence. Through the gray, scudding clouds and the persistent drizzle, a darker smudge on the horizon began to resolve itself into a formidable headland. Porthgero. Even from a distance, it looked like a fist raised against the turbulent sea. And perched upon its highest point, skeletal against the bruised sky, was the lighthouse, a slender finger of granite pointing accusingly at the heavens. The adjacent keeper's cottage seemed to cling to its base like a limpet, braced for the next onslaught. Nearly there, Mr. Vance. The voice, gruff and resonant as the grind of shingle under a heavy tide, belonged to Iago, the boatman. He hadn't spoken more than a dozen words since they'd left the relative shelter of Port Isaac, his face a weathered map of sea miles and unspoken local lore, eyes narrowed against the wind. Elias nodded, unable to muster much more. His stomach was a knot of unease, less from the boat's bucking and more from the sheer, unyielding remoteness of their destination. As the Sea Serpent chugged into a marginally calmer cove, a jagged gash in the cliffs barely wide enough for the boat, Porthgero loomed above them, immense and forbidding. The lighthouse tower, even decommissioned, possessed a stark, severe beauty. Its lantern gallery was dark, the great lenses within like blind eyes. The cottage, built of the same grey stone, looked small and vulnerable. A narrow, treacherous-looking path snaked its way up the cliff face towards it. Iago expertly maneuvered the boat alongside a slippery, weed-covered stone jetty. High tide's your friend for landing. Low tide, it's a scramble. He cut the engine, and the sudden silence was immediately devoured by the roar of the surf against the outer rocks and the mournful cry of gulls circling overhead. The wind, a constant, palpable presence, whistled through the crags, carrying with it 1,000 tiny, sighing whispers. Together, they manhandled Elias's crates of supplies, cataloging equipment, and personal belongings onto the jetty. The air was thick with the smell of brine, damp stone, and something else, a faint, metallic tang that Elias couldn't quite place. Rust, perhaps. Or old blood. He dismissed the morbid thought. Blaming the dramatic landscape. When the last crate was precariously balanced, Iago wiped his hands on his oilskins, his gaze fixed on the silent lighthouse. His leathery face was unreadable, but his eyes, the color of sea slate, held a strange, distant focus. 3 weeks, then, Elias said, breaking the silence, trying for a note of brisk professionalism. Weather permitting, of course. Iago finally looked at him. Aye. Weather always has its say out here. He paused, then added, his voice dropping slightly, they're not angry, Mr. Vance. Just tired. They want to be seen again. Don't ignore the songs in the wind. He took a step back towards his boat, then hesitated, one hand on the gunwale. And if the light returns, follow it. Elias blinked. He'd anticipated some local color, perhaps a tall tale or two about smugglers or wreckers, but this was delivered with a solemnity that was unsettling. The light, he questioned, a frown creasing his brow. The lighthouse has been decommissioned for 60 years. The mechanism is seized, the lenses are probably cracked beyond repair. Trinity House records are quite clear on that. He prided himself on his research. Iago just gave a slow, deliberate nod, his expression unchanging. Records say one thing. The stone remembers another. He swung himself aboard the sea serpent with practiced ease. Good luck to ye, Mr. Vance. The engine coughed back to life, a plume of oily smoke momentarily obscuring the boatman before the wind snatched it away. Elias watched as the sea serpent backed out of the cove, turned its blunt nose towards the turbulent open water, and began its journey back, shrinking with alarming speed until it was just another speck tossed by the gray waves. Then, he was alone. Utterly, profoundly alone. The wind howled around him, seeming to pluck at his coat, its voice a constant, sibilant murmur. The songs in the wind, Iago had called them. Elias shivered, though not entirely from the cold. Superstition, he told himself firmly. The product of an isolated life, of too many long nights spent listening to the sea. He was an archivist, a man of facts and tangible evidence. He was here to document, not to indulge in fanciful folklore. He turned his attention to the daunting task of hauling his gear up the cliff path. It was even more precarious than it looked from the water, slick with damp moss and loose scree. By the time he'd wrestled the last crate to the small, windswept yard in front of the keeper's cottage, his muscles ached and he was breathing heavily. The cottage door, a sturdy oak affair painted a faded, salt-blasted blue, was unlocked. It creaked open onto a surprisingly well-preserved interior. Dust lay thick on everything, of course, but the furniture, a simple wooden table and chairs, a couple of worn armchairs draped in white sheets, a sturdy dresser, was intact. Shelves lined one wall, crammed with salt-warped books, nautical charts yellowed with age, and what looked like ledgers. It was as if the last keeper had, as the preliminary report suggested, simply walked away mid-task. A short, covered walkway, its windows clouded with salt spray, connected the cottage to the base of the lighthouse tower. Elias peered through a grimy pane. The interior of the tower was a shadowy spiral, vanishing upwards into darkness. He could make out the massive, inert bulk of the lamp mechanism far above, silent and still. He spent the rest of the afternoon setting up a rudimentary living space in the cottage's main room. The promised generator, housed in a small stone outbuilding, grumbled to life after a few resentful coughs, providing power for a couple of bare light bulbs and his laptop. There was, as expected, no phone signal, no internet. Just the ceaseless roar of the waves and the sighing wind. He laid out his primary tools, archival quality notebooks, pencils, a digital camera, magnifying glass, and cotton gloves. His first task would be to survey the contents of the cottage, then the tower. The Porthgero collection, as Trinity House had designated it, was rumored to be extensive, spanning nearly a century of light-keeping. Shipping logs, maintenance records, weather journals, personal correspondence, a microcosm of lives dictated by the lamp and the ocean. As dusk began to bleed into the gray sky, tinting the churning sea with shades of purple and bruised orange, Elias made himself a simple meal of tin stew heated on a small camping stove. He ate at the wooden table, the wind rattling the windowpanes, the generator a distant thrum beneath the natural cacophony. He felt the deep, bone-weary satisfaction of physical exertion, a pleasant counterpoint to the usual mental fatigue of his profession. The isolation, he decided, wasn't oppressive. It was clarifying. Here, there were no distractions, no demands save those of the task at hand. He could immerse himself in the history, in the meticulous ordering of the past. He felt a sense of purpose settle over him, a welcome antidote to the lingering unease Iago's words had stirred. Later, wrapped in a thick sweater, he sat in one of the armchairs, a maritime history of Cornwall open on his lap, though his eyes kept straying to the window. The darkness outside was absolute, a thick, impenetrable blackness broken only by the white foam of the waves crashing against the cliffs below. The wind seemed to have picked up, its voice now a mournful howl that pressed against the cottage walls. He could almost imagine words in its varied tones, fragments of sentences snatched away before they could cohere. The songs in the wind. He shook his head, annoyed at his own fancifulness. He decided to turn in early. The journey, the hauling, the sheer sensory overload of the place had taken their toll. He made his way to the small bedroom, where a narrow bed with a surprisingly clean mattress awaited. The air was cold, carrying the persistent damp chill of a house long unheated. He burrowed under the blankets he'd brought, the sound of the generator a faint, reassuring hum. Sleep, however, was elusive. His mind, usually so adept at compartmentalizing, kept replaying Yago's cryptic warning. They're not angry, just tired. They want to be seen again. And if the light returns, follow it. What an absurd notion. A light returning from a 60-year dead mechanism. Preposterous. He must have drifted off eventually, because he found himself surfacing from a shallow, uneasy doze. The generator was still humming. The wind still moaned. But something was different. A subtle shift in the atmosphere, a feeling of attention. He lay still, listening intently. The rhythmic crash of waves, the keening of the wind. Nothing out of the ordinary. He was just overtired, his imagination working overtime in this isolated, evocative place. Then he saw it. Through the small, salt-caked window of his bedroom, which faced towards the lighthouse tower, a light. Not a bright, piercing beam, not the commanding sweep he knew a functioning lighthouse would cast. This was a faint, almost ethereal pulse. A dim, soft glow, emanating from the lantern room high above. It swelled gently, held for a second, then faded, only to swell again a few moments later. A heartbeat. A slow, rhythmic, impossible heartbeat. Elias sat bolt upright in bed, his own heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. He stared, disbelieving. It couldn't be. The lamp was broken, derelict. There was no power to it, no one to operate it. He must be mistaken. A reflection, perhaps. The moon breaking through the clouds. But the clouds were a thick, unbroken ceiling, and the pulse was too regular, too deliberate to be a trick of moonlight. It came from within the lantern room. He scrambled out of bed, his bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor. He moved to the window, pressing his face close to the glass, trying to see more clearly. The pulse continued, faint but undeniable. A soft, ghostly illumination in the heart of the dead tower. Yago's words slammed back into his mind with the force of a rogue wave: if the light returns, follow it. Elias's throat was dry. His meticulously ordered world, his bedrock of logic and pragmatism, felt as if it were tilting on its axis. This was not in the records. This was not in any Trinity House report. This was impossible. And yet, the light pulsed on, a silent, luminous enigma in the deep Cornish night. A fragile beacon, beckoning from a place where no light should be. The salt-stained lullabies of Porthgero light. Part 6, Reflection. The generator, housed in a small, moss-slicked shed a short trudge from the cottage, was Elias's most temperamental companion. It coughed and spluttered its way to life each morning, a reluctant dragon roused from slumber, and its grumbling hum was the nearest thing to a constant heartbeat Porthgero possessed, aside from the relentless crash of waves against the cliffs below. Tonight, its rhythm seemed more erratic, the lights in the small bathroom flickering as Elias splashed cold, tinny water onto his face. He'd spent a long day hunched over a series of ledgers detailing 19th-century paraffin deliveries and wick replacements, the meticulous script a stark contrast to the wildness outside. The wind, a constant unseen tormentor, had been particularly fierce, rattling the window panes and shrieking down the lighthouse tower's stone throat like a banshee. The work was absorbing, the kind of focused, tangible task he usually found solace in, but here, even the mundane felt imbued with a creeping sense of unease. He was tired, his eyes gritty from deciphering faded ink by the light of his battery-powered desk lamp. He straightened, water dripping from his chin, and glanced at his reflection in the small, age-spotted mirror above the chipped porcelain sink. The glass was old, its silvering imperfect, creating faint distortions at the edges. He saw his own tired face, the lines around his eyes more pronounced in the dim, unsteady light. Then, for an infinitesimal, stomach-lurching instant, as he began to turn his head to reach for the towel, the Elias in the mirror turned the other way. It was a flicker, a trick of the light, a product of exhaustion. He blinked, hard. Shook his head, a small, sharp movement. Of course it was. He was alone, tired, in an old, isolated building. His brain was playing catch-up. He peered at the mirror again. His reflection stared back, static, obediently mirroring his every slight movement. Just tired. He snatched the thin, slightly damp towel from the rail and rubbed his face vigorously, as if to scrub away the lingering image. Yet, a sliver of disquiet, cold and sharp, lodged itself beneath his ribs. He tried to dismiss it as he prepared for bed, the cottage creaking around him like an old ship in a heavy swell. The sounds were becoming almost familiar, the sigh of the wind through ill-fitting window frames, the distant moan of the sea, the occasional scritch-scratch that could be mice or could be something else entirely. He'd taken to cataloging these sounds as well, a mental list he tried to keep rational. But the image from the mirror, that brief, impossible dissonance, refused to be neatly filed away. The next afternoon, the weather, with its typical Cornish perversity, had shifted. The wind had dropped to a mournful sigh, and a thick, grey fog had rolled in from the sea, swallowing the headland whole. The lighthouse tower, usually a stoic sentinel, was now a ghostly silhouette, its top lost in the swirling vapor. The fog-muffled sound, creating an oppressive, claustrophobic silence broken only by the mournful bellow of a distant foghorn, not Porthgerro's, long silent, but some other unfortunate vessel feeling its way through the treacherous waters. Elias was in the main room of the cottage, sorting through a stack of damp-damaged charts. He'd found them in a sea chest beneath the window seat, their edges feathered and stained with salt. He laid one out on the scarred wooden table, trying to smooth its creases, his fingers tracing the faded contours of the coastline, the meticulously penned depths and warnings. The fog outside pressed against the window panes, giving the glass a milky, opaque quality. Condensation trickled in rivulets down the inside. He needed better light. The generator was chugging along, but the single overhead bulb cast deep shadows. He stood, intending to fetch his powerful work lamp from his bag in the bedroom, and as he turned, he glanced idly at the window nearest the door. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Reflected in the dim, fog-blanketed glass, standing just behind his own translucent image, was a figure. Dark. Tall. Indistinct, more a shape of deeper shadow than a person, but undeniably there, in the space between him and the far wall. His breath hitched. His blood ran cold, a primal shock that tightened his scalp and sent a jolt down his spine. It was a man's silhouette, he thought, though the features were lost in the gloom of the reflection and the swirling gray beyond the pane. It was simply, there. He spun around, a choked gasp escaping him. The room was empty. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering from the fog-shrouded window. The draped furniture stood silent. The stack of charts lay undisturbed on the table. The faint smell of old paper, damp wool, and brine hung in the air, unchanged. There was nothing. No one. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He backed away, step by slow step, until his shoulders hit the cold stone of the chimney breast. His gaze darted around the small room, into the shadowy corners, towards the closed door of the bedroom, the equally closed door leading to the covered walkway and the lighthouse tower. Empty. All empty. He forced himself to breathe, slowly, deeply, the air feeling thick and insufficient in his lungs. It had to be the fog. The strange light. The condensation on the glass creating phantoms. Like the mirror. Exhaustion. Isolation. His pragmatic mind scrambled for purchase, for any explanation that didn't involve the impossible. He approached the window cautiously, as if it might bite. He stared at his own reflection, pale and wide-eyed. Behind him, the room was faithfully, emptily, reflected. He wiped a hand over the condensation, smearing it, then peered out into the impenetrable gray. Nothing but fog, a formless, silent entity that had consumed the world. But the image had been so clear, so undeniably present. Not a fleeting trick this time. It had been a solid, albeit shadowy, form. And it had been behind him. A new kind of fear, colder and more insidious than simple fright, began to uncoil in his stomach. This wasn't just about strange noises or misplaced objects. This was about his own senses, his own perception of reality, being subtly, terrifyingly undermined. The fog outside felt less like a weather phenomenon and more like a shroud, isolating him further, trapping him with whatever resided within the salt-stained walls of Porthgaro. He didn't fetch the lamp. He couldn't bring himself to turn his back on the room, on the windows, for even a moment. The charts lay forgotten. The meticulous cataloging, his shield against the unknown, suddenly felt fragile, inadequate. The silence of the cottage, once a refuge, now seemed to hum with unspoken, unseen presences. He spent the rest of the afternoon sitting stiffly in the keeper's worn armchair, facing the door, a heavy brass candlestick clutched in his hand, not for light, but for defense. The foghorn continued its mournful lament out in the grey void, a sound that seemed to echo the desolation blooming within him. The reflection in the window, and the one in the bathroom mirror, were no longer dismissible. They were invitations, or perhaps warnings, from a place he was increasingly certain he was not alone in. And whatever shared this desolate spit of land with him was beginning to make its presence known, not just in the sighing wind or the creaking boards, but in the very fabric of what he saw, or thought he saw. The edges of his carefully constructed reality were starting to fray. The thrum of the sea serpent's old diesel engine was a ragged counterpoint to the mournful cries of gulls circling overhead. Elias Vance, bundled against the biting Cornish wind, gripped the gunwale, his knuckles white. Porthgaro Head loomed out of the grey September mist, a monstrous fist of granite thrusting defiantly into the churning Atlantic. Atop it, skeletal and stark, Porthgaro Lighthouse was a broken tooth against a bruised sky. "She's a grim old beast, ain't she?" shouted Jacob Penrose, the boatman, his voice a gravelly rasp over the engine's roar and the crash of waves against the hull. His face, weathered as the cliffs themselves, was etched with a network of lines that spoke of countless storms and a life lived in thrall to the sea. Elias merely nodded, his gaze fixed on the tower. Grim, yes, but also compelling. He'd always been drawn to such places, monuments to human resilience against the indifferent might of nature. This particular commission, to decommission the archive, to catalogue the final remnants of Porthgaro's life, was a curious blend of the professional and the personal. After the quiet implosion of his marriage and the subtle sidelining at the National Maritime Archive, the isolation offered a stark appeal. 3 weeks. No emails, no phone calls, just him and the ghosts of history. Penrose cut the engine, and the sudden quiet was almost shocking, filled immediately by the roar of surf on unseen rocks and the keening wind. He expertly maneuvered the sea serpent towards a narrow, precarious inlet carved into the cliff face, where a series of slimy, iron rungs ascended to a small, wave-battered landing. "This is as far as I go," Penrose said, his eyes avoiding the lighthouse itself. "Tide's turning. Path up to the cottage is there." He gestured with a calloused thumb. "Steps can be slick. Mind your footing." Elias, already laden with his rucksack and a heavy waterproof holdall containing his initial supplies and tools, began to transfer the rest of his gear, crates of archival boxes, food, water, a small generator. Penrose helped, his movements economical, his silence profound. Once the last crate was precariously perched on the landing, Penrose pushed off. "I'll be back for you in 3 weeks. October the 12th. Weather permitting, mind." He paused, then added, his voice lower, almost a murmur, "They say the old songs the wind sings out here, they ain't always just wind, Mr. Vance. Keep your wits about you." He didn't wait for a reply, engaging the engine with a cough and a sputter, turning the sea serpent back towards the distant, hazy promise of Portland. Elias watched until the boat was a mere speck, swallowed by the mist. Then, he was alone. Truly alone. The wind whipped at his coat, tasting of salt and something else, something ancient and wild. He took a deep breath, the cold air searing his lungs. Time to begin. The climb was arduous, each iron rung slick with algae, the path a treacherous ribbon of mud and loose stones winding up the headland. By the time he reached the small plateau where the keeper's cottage huddled against the base of the lighthouse tower, his legs ached and he was sweating despite the chill. The cottage was stone-built, sturdy, its windows small and salt-caked. A covered walkway, little more than a stone tunnel, connected it to the lighthouse itself. Elias fumbled with the heavy iron key Penrose had given him, the lock groaning in protest before finally yielding. The air inside was thick, cold, and heavy with the scent of damp stone, dust, and a faint, lingering aroma that reminded him of his grandmother's cedar chest, overlaid with the sharp tang of brine. Furniture, a sturdy wooden table, a few chairs, a sagging armchair, was draped in dusty white sheets, spectral shapes in the gloom. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with salt-warped books, rolled charts, and an assortment of nautical paraphernalia. It was, as the brief had stated, surprisingly well preserved, as if its last occupant had merely stepped out for a moment, decades ago, and never returned. His first task was the generator. He found it in a small, stone outhouse, a hulking, temperamental beast. After a protracted struggle, it coughed into life with a deafening roar, and a few dim, flickering bulbs in the cottage blinked erratically, casting long, dancing shadows. Unreliable, the briefing had warned. Essential, Elias knew. The rest of the day was spent in a flurry of methodical activity. He unpacked his supplies, designated a corner of the main room as his workspace, and conducted an initial survey of the cottage. 3 rooms, a kitchen living area, a small bedroom with a narrow cot, and a cramped study, its desk buried under stacks of ledgers and charts. Everything was coated in a fine layer of dust and salt crystals. As dusk began to bleed into the gray sky, painting the churning sea in shades of violet and indigo, Elias made himself a rudimentary meal of tinned stew, eaten at the dusty table. The wind howled around the cottage, a ceaseless, mournful voice. Occasionally, the generator would sputter, the lights dimming alarmingly before catching again. He tried to ignore the profound sense of isolation, focusing on the task ahead. Tomorrow, the cataloging would begin in earnest. He found the main collection of archival material in the study, shipping logs, meticulously kept weather journals, maintenance records for the lamp, official correspondence. All the mundane, essential paperwork that chronicled the life of a lighthouse. He ran a finger over a leather-bound logbook, its cover stiff and cool. Porthgero Lighthouse, Keeper's Log, 1898 to 1905. History, tangible and waiting. That first night, sleep was elusive. The wind was a living entity, pressing against the cottage walls, rattling the window panes. The sea's roar was a constant, primal rhythm. And beneath it all, Elias fancied he could hear other sounds, the sigh of the wind through the empty lantern housing of the lighthouse, a sound that seemed almost vocal. He told himself it was the strangeness of the place, the solitude. He was a man of logic, of documented fact. He would not succumb to flights of fancy. He drifted into a restless sleep filled with images of crashing waves and the solitary, unblinking eye of a lighthouse lamp he knew was long extinguished. Part 2, The Locked Drawer. The following morning dawned gray and blustery, the sea a maelstrom of white-capped waves. Elias forced himself into a routine, coffee, a stale biscuit, then straight to the study. He started with the most recent documents, working his way backward, a familiar process that usually brought him a sense of calm, of order imposed on chaos. The keeper's logs were, for the most part, prosaic. Weather conditions, passing ships, maintenance notes. Replaced wick in primary lamp. Gale force winds from SW, seas heavy. Resupplied by Porthlum Cutter. Yet, even in these factual entries, a sense of the keeper's isolation, their unwavering vigilance, seeped through. The desk in the study was a large, sturdy oak piece, its surface scarred and ink-stained. It had 3 drawers on one side, 2 of which opened easily, revealing more bundled papers, spare pens, and a collection of tarnished brass instruments Elias couldn't immediately identify. The bottom drawer, however, was locked. It was a simple lock, but stout. Elias tried the keys Penrose had given him, but none fit. His archivist's curiosity, a professional itch he couldn't ignore, was piqued. Important documents were often kept under lock and key. He made a mental note to search for a stray key later. For now, he returned to the logbooks. By mid-afternoon, a persistent drizzle had set in, blurring the already indistinct line between sea and sky. The generator chugged along, a comfort against the encroaching gloom. Elias was meticulously cataloging a series of tide charts when he remembered the locked drawer. He rummaged through the box of tools he'd brought, a small pry bar, a set of screwdrivers. Not ideal for picking locks, but perhaps. He examined the drawer again. It seemed to be made of thicker wood than the others. Above the lock, almost obscured by grime, a small, tarnished brass plate was affixed. He rubbed it with his sleeve. Faintly engraved lettering emerged, for the final keeper. A small shiver, unrelated to the cottage's pervasive damp, traced its way down Elias's spine. The final keeper. That was, technically, him, wasn't it? Hired to close the book on Porthgarrow. He selected a thin, sturdy screwdriver and a tension wrench from his multi-tool. He was no locksmith, but he'd opened a few stubborn archival cabinets in his time. After a few minutes of careful probing, there was a soft click. The drawer slid open with a reluctant groan. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a small, rusted metal box, about the size of a shoebox. It too was locked, with a simple clasp. This one, however, yielded easily to a little pressure from the screwdriver. The lid creaked upwards. The first thing he saw was a child's drawing on brittle, yellowed paper. It depicted a crudely drawn lighthouse, tall and black against a stormy sky. At the very top of the tower, where the lantern should be, a stick figure stood, rendered entirely in thick, black crayon, its arms outstretched. At the bottom of the page, scrawled in uneven, childish handwriting, were the words, "He waits for you to finish the light." Elias stared at the drawing, a knot tightening in his stomach. The simplicity of it, the starkness of the black figure, was deeply unsettling. It wasn't the art of a happy child. He carefully lifted the drawing. Beneath it lay a single, folded slip of equally yellowed paper. He unfolded it with trembling fingers. It was a note, written in an elegant, spidery script, the ink faded but still legible. To whomever finds this, know that the light is not the only thing that failed here. The whispers are true. The sea takes, but sometimes it gives back what you don't want. I tried to keep them safe. I tried. And then, at the bottom, a date and a signature that made the blood freeze in Elias's veins. October 17, 1912. E. Vance. Elias dropped the note as if it had burned him. E. Vance. His own surname. He snatched it up again, his heart hammering against his ribs. Could it be a coincidence? Vance wasn't an uncommon name. But here, in this remote lighthouse, tied to this disturbing drawing and a cryptic message about finishing a light, he felt a sudden, dizzying sense of unreality. The wind outside seemed to intensify, its moan taking on a new, almost mocking tone. The generator sputtered, the lights flickered violently, then steadied, but the momentary plunge into near darkness had amplified the dread coiling in his gut. He looked from the signature back to the child's drawing. He waits for you to finish the light. Who waited? The black figure. And what did it mean to finish a light that had been extinguished for over half a century, its mechanism frozen, its lenses cracked. Elias stood there for a long moment, the drawing in one hand, the note signed by an E. Vance in the other. The pragmatic archivist in him was scrambling for a rational explanation. An ancestor he never knew about. A distant relative who had been a keeper here. It was possible. He knew little of his family history beyond his grandparents. But the label on the drawer, for the final keeper, and the contents, it felt less like historical happenstance and more like a carefully laid, impossibly patient trap. He carefully placed the drawing and the note back in the metal box, his hands unsteady. He didn't close the lid. He couldn't. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to get out of the study, out of the cottage. He stumbled into the main room, the wind's howl seeming to claw at the very stones of the building. He looked out of a salt-grimed window at the tumultuous sea, gray and unforgiving. Penrose's warning echoed in his mind, "They say the old songs the wind sings out here, they ain't always just wind." The rational part of his brain was already formulating research strategies. He needed to cross-reference keeper lists, search for any record of an E. Vance stationed at Porthgaro around 1912. He needed to find out who the child was, the one who had drawn that unsettling picture. But another part of him, a colder, more primal part, whispered that the answers he sought wouldn't be found in dusty ledgers alone. They were here, in the salt-laced air, in the rhythmic crash of the waves, in the oppressive silence of the extinguished lamp, and perhaps, in the legacy of a man who shared his name and, it seemed, a warning meant for him. The discovery in the locked drawer had changed everything. His meticulous cataloging now felt like a smokescreen for a far more personal and disturbing investigation. Porthgaro Light had been waiting. And now, it seemed, it had him. Part 3, Whispers and Echoes. The rest of that day passed in a haze of disquiet. Elias found it impossible to concentrate on the official archives. The child's drawing, the signature, E. Vance, the ominous phrase, "Finish the light," they looped relentlessly in his mind. He made several attempts to search the existing personnel records for any mention of an E. Vance from the early 20th century, but the files were haphazard, incomplete, and in no discernible order that far back. It would take days, perhaps weeks, to sift through them properly. He kept the metal box on the table beside him, its contents a stark reminder of the mystery that had unfurled. He found himself glancing at the drawing repeatedly, the black figure at the top of the lighthouse seeming to stare back with unseen eyes. As evening drew in, the weather deteriorated further. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and rain lashed against the windows with furious intensity. The generator, protesting the strain, began to fail more frequently. Each time the lights flickered and died, plunging the cottage into suffocating darkness, Elias's nerves frayed a little more. He kept his powerful flashlight close at hand, its beam cutting a swathe through the oppressive gloom, making shadows dance and leap in unsettling ways. It was during one of these blackouts, as he sat hunched over a plate of rapidly cooling beans, that he first heard it distinctly. Over the roar of the storm, a faint sound, almost lost in the cacophony, a child humming. A simple, melancholic tune, a fragment of a lullaby, it seemed to emanate from no particular direction, woven into the fabric of the wind's lament. He froze, fork halfway to his mouth. His blood ran cold. He strained his ears, but it was gone, swallowed by the storm. Just the wind, he told himself, his heart thudding. The wind plays tricks in a place like this. Penrose had said as much. But the seed of unease, planted by the contents of the locked drawer, had taken root and was now sprouting with unnerving speed. Later, as he lay on the narrow cot, wrapped in a damp-smelling blanket, sleep was an impossibility. The humming returned, clearer this time, weaving in and out of the wind's mournful sighs. It was undeniably the sound of a child. And then, another sound joined it, the soft, rhythmic creak of wood and metal, a sound he instinctively recognized. It was the sound of the lighthouse lamp mechanism, the slow, ponderous rotation he'd read about in the maintenance logs. But the lamp at Porthgaro was broken, seized, its great Fresnel lenses cracked and dull. It hadn't turned in decades. He sat bolt upright, his skin prickling. He could feel it, too, a faint, almost imperceptible vibration through the stone walls of the cottage, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to resonate deep within his own chest, like a second, alien heartbeat. He scrambled for his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, and rushed to the window. The lighthouse tower was a black sentinel against the raging storm, its lantern housing dark, inert. Yet the sound, the feeling, persisted. He began to question his own senses. Was this the effect of isolation? The power of suggestion after finding the box? He was a man of reason, of empirical evidence. This was something else. The following days became a strange, unsettling rhythm of mundane work and escalating phenomena. He forced himself to continue cataloging, his entries becoming more terse, his handwriting tighter. But his focus was fractured. Every creak of the cottage, every sigh of the wind, now carried a potential hidden meaning. He started noticing small things. An old clay pipe, the kind he'd seen in photographs of Victorian seafarers, appeared on the mantelpiece in the main room. He was certain it hadn't been there before. He picked it up, the bowl was cold, empty, yet for a fleeting moment, he caught the distinct, sweet aroma of old pipe tobacco. A child's wooden toy boat, crudely carved and painted a faded blue, materialized on the windowsill of the study. He'd meticulously cleared that sill himself on the first day. He moved it, placing it in an empty archival box. The next morning, it was back on the windowsill, a tiny dusting of fresh salt around its base as if it had just been plucked from the sea. Cold spots began to appear and disappear throughout the cottage, pockets of unnatural chill that had nothing to do with the drafts. One moment he'd be working at the desk, the next a wave of icy air would wash over him, raising gooseflesh on his arms, even though the small electric heater he'd brought hummed nearby. The whispers became more frequent, no longer just carried on the wind but seeming to emanate from the very walls of the cottage. Snatches of words, too faint to decipher, but undeniably human. Sometimes, he thought he could hear a woman's soft weeping, a sound of profound, inconsolable sorrow, almost indistinguishable from the cry of a distant gull. He found a tattered, dark wool shawl, smelling faintly of lavender and seawater, draped over the back of the armchair where he often sat to read in the evenings. He had never seen it before. He touched it, the wool was damp, cold. His research into events yielded little beyond frustration. The early 20th century records were a mess. He did, however, find a series of logbook entries from late 1912, penned by a keeper named Thomas Ashton. Ashton's entries, initially as meticulous as any other, became increasingly erratic. Mentions of unsettling dreams, noises in the tower, and Ilara's worsening melancholy began to appear. Ilara. His wife. Then, a stark entry dated November 5, 1912, Lily gone. Sea took her. Ilara inconsolable. Light is out. Cannot fix. God help us. Lily. A child. The name hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. He looked at the child's drawing again, the black figure, the plea to finish the light. Could Lily have been the artist? He found a later addendum, scrawled in a desperate, barely legible hand, clearly Ashton's, the singing won't stop. She blames the light. She blames me. I hear Lily sometimes. In the wind. In the lamp room. After that, the official logbook entries became sparse, almost incoherent, for several weeks, before a new keeper's handwriting appeared, noting the lighthouse was found in disarray, keeper Ashton and wife missing, presumed lost at sea. No mention of an advance taking over. Elias felt a growing dread. Thomas Ashton, Ilara, Lily. A family tragedy. But where did his namesake, Vance, fit into this? Was the note in the box from this Vance, a contemporary observer, or something else? The photograph albums he found were even more disturbing. They were filled with stiff, formal portraits of various keepers and their families, posing proudly before the lighthouse. He found one of Thomas Ashton, a stern-faced man with a thick mustache, his wife Alara, a pale, sad-eyed woman, and a small girl, no older than 6 or 7, with wide, solemn eyes, Lily. She clutched a doll. He studied their faces, trying to glean some understanding of their lives, their fates. As he looked at one particular photograph of the family standing at the base of the tower, he noticed something odd. In the shadowed doorway of the cottage behind them, almost invisible, was another figure. Indistinct, blurry, as if caught in motion or half faded from the print. He held it closer to the sputtering light. It looked like a man, tall and thin, but the details were impossible to make out. He checked other photos from the same period. The figure wasn't there. He put the photograph down, his hand shaking slightly. Had it always been there, or had it appeared? His dreams became a battleground. He dreamt of raging storms viewed from the top of the lighthouse, of a little girl's laughter turning to screams, of a woman's anguished cries echoing in the stone tower. He saw fragmented images, a broken porcelain doll washed up on the rocks, small, muddy footprints leading to the cliff edge, the massive gears of the lamp mechanism grinding, grinding. He would wake with a gasp, tangled in his blanket, the phantom pulse of the lamp still throbbing in his ears, the scent of lavender and salt in the air. He started talking to himself, a habit he'd never had before. Narrating his actions, questioning the strange occurrences aloud. As if needing to hear a human voice, even his own, to affirm his sanity. One afternoon, while sifting through a box of miscellaneous personal effects, tarnished silver, a prayer book, a collection of seashells, he found a small, leather-bound diary. Its pages were brittle, the ink faded. The handwriting was delicate, unmistakably feminine. Alara Ashton's diary. His heart quickened. This could hold answers. He opened it carefully. The early entries were filled with the mundane details of a lighthouse keeper's wife, tending a small, wind-battered garden, mending clothes, observations about the weather. But as the entries progressed into the autumn of 1912, the tone shifted. October 10th, Thomas is worried about the lamp. It has been temperamental. The light seems dimmer, somehow. Lily says the shadows in the tower are growing longer. She has taken to drawing strange pictures of a tall man who watches from the lantern. Elias's breath caught. The black figure in Lily's drawing. October 14th, I hear whispers. When Thomas is in the tower, and Lily is asleep. Not the wind. Words. Sad words. And the lullaby. Lily says she hears it too now. A song the sea sings only for us. The salt-stained lullabies. October 17th, a visitor. Mr. Vance. From the Trinity House, he says. To inspect the new mantel Thomas fitted. He is peculiar. Quiet. Stares at the light for hours. Says little. His eyes are like the deep sea. Elias's hands tightened on the diary. E. Vance. He was real. He was here. October 17th, 1912, the same date as on the note in the metal box. October 20th, Mr. Vance is still here. The weather has turned, no boat can reach us. He spends most of his time in the tower. Thomas dislikes him. Says he interferes. I saw him talking to Lily today. He gave her a small, carved bird. She seems drawn to him, yet fearful. He told her stories of the old ones of the sea. October 25th, the lamp failed tonight during the storm. Thomas is frantic. Mr. Vance tried to help, but he seemed almost pleased. He spoke of old ways and other lights. I don't trust him. His presence feels like a shroud over this place. The entries grew more fragmented, more desperate. Alara wrote of worsening storms, of Lily's increasing fear, of Thomas's descent into agitated despair. She mentioned Mr. Vance's calm, almost serene demeanor amidst the chaos, his strange pronouncements about the sea and the light. Then, a final, terrifying entry, the handwriting jagged, almost illegible. November 4th, he took her. Vance. Said the sea called for her, that the light demanded it. Thomas tried to stop him. Oh God, Lily, my Lily. He said it wasn't finished. He said the light needed a new song. He waits. He always waits. Elias stared at the page, the words blurring before his eyes. A cold dread, far deeper than anything he had felt before, enveloped him. Vance. Not a victim, not a concerned observer, but something else entirely. An instigator. A harbinger. The black figure in Lily's drawing. The generator outside gave a violent cough, spluttered, and died. The cottage plunged into absolute darkness. This time, the silence that followed the generator's demise was not empty. It was filled with the roar of the wind, the crash of the waves, and something else. A faint, rhythmic creaking from the walkway connecting the cottage to the lighthouse tower. And then, a soft, dragging sound, approaching his study door. Elias's blood turned to ice. He fumbled for his flashlight, his hands slick with sweat. He was no longer just an archivist uncovering a tragedy. He was part of it. And Vance, it seemed, was still waiting. Part 4, The Unraveling. The beam of Elias's flashlight sliced through the oppressive darkness, shaking in his trembling hand. The dragging sound stopped just outside the study door. He held his breath, every nerve screaming. The silence stretched, taut and suffocating, broken only by the relentless storm and the frantic thumping of his own heart. Then, a soft rapping at the door. 3 distinct knocks, gentle, almost polite. Elias didn't move, didn't breathe. Who, or what, could be out there? Mr. Vance. A voice, soft and hesitant, filtered through the wooden panel. A child's voice. Lily's voice. Are you there, Mr. Vance? The lamp, it's so dark. Elias felt a chilling wave of nausea. This couldn't be real. He squeezed his eyes shut, then opened them again, sweeping the flashlight beam across the door. Nothing. He was alone. It had to be the wind, the strain, his imagination working overtime, fueled by Ilara's horrifying diary entries. He forced himself to speak, his voice a ragged whisper. Who's there? Silence. Only the storm answered. He slowly backed away from the door, his gaze fixed on it. The handle, old and brass, remained still. He retreated to the main room, the diary clutched in his hand like a talisman. He had to get the generator working again. Darkness was a breeding ground for this insidious creep of terror. The outhouse was a maelstrom of wind and driving rain. Shielding the flashlight, he wrestled with the generator, his fingers numb and clumsy. It coughed, sputtered, then roared back to defiant life. The cottage lights flickered on, weak but blessedly present. Back inside, soaked and shivering, he locked the cottage door, jamming a chair under the handle for good measure, a futile gesture, he knew, if what he feared was already inside, or not entirely physical. He reread Ilara's final, frantic entry. He took her. Vance. Said the sea called for her, that the light demanded it. He said it wasn't finished. He said the light needed a new song. This Vance, this namesake of his, was not an ancestor to be researched, but a malevolent force, an architect of tragedy. And Lily's drawing. He waits for you to finish the light. Was this original Vance? And was he, Elias Vance, the archivist, somehow expected to complete some terrible, unfinished task? The phenomena intensified over the next few days, as if his discovery of Ilara's diary had broken some seal. The faint smell of lavender became pervasive, sometimes cloyingly sweet, at other times mixed with the stench of stagnant seawater. Objects didn't just move, they relocated with baffling purpose. One morning he found the faded blue toy boat nestled on his pillow. Another time, the tattered wool shawl was carefully folded on his research notes, obscuring the very page he'd been working on, a manifest listing supplies delivered in October 1912, including specialized filament components for experimental lamp modification. Attention, Mr. E. Vance, visiting engineer. An engineer. Not just a Trinity House inspector. An engineer with experimental components. The whispers were clearer now. He could almost make out words, phrases carried on the wind, seeping through the stone. Cold, so cold, Mama, the light, watch the light, and always, interwoven, the haunting fragment of the child's lullaby. He began to find small, wet handprints, undeniably child-sized, on the dusty surfaces of the lighthouse itself. He'd started making brief, reluctant forays into the tower, drawn by an inexplicable compulsion, despite the palpable dread that clung to its spiraling staircase. The air inside was freezing, the silence profound, broken only by the wind whistling through the cracked lenses of the lantern housing and the phantom creak and pulse of the long-dead mechanism, a sound that now seemed to thrum directly in his bones. One afternoon, he found a new entry in one of the blank keeper's logbooks he'd set out for his own notes. It was scrawled in a frantic, spidery script he recognized instantly from the note in the metal box, the handwriting of the 1912 E. Vance. The new keeper is here. He feels it. He hears the songs. Soon he will understand what must be done. The sequence must be completed. The resonance achieved. The little one is the key, always the key. Elias recoiled. The entry referred to him. It was dated that very day. He snatched up his pen, his own neat academic script, a stark contrast. "Who are you?" he wrote beneath the chilling message. "What do you want?" He left the logbook open on the desk, a desperate, irrational attempt at communication. His own mental state was deteriorating. Sleep deprivation, constant anxiety, and the unceasing sensory assault were taking their toll. He found himself questioning every sight, every sound. Was the faint taste of salt that sometimes coated his tongue real, or a psychosomatic response to the environment? Were the fleeting shadows he saw in his peripheral vision just tricks of the light, or something more? He started to lose track of time. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of gray skies, howling wind, and creeping dread. His meticulous notes became erratic, interspersed with rambling thoughts, questions, and sketches of the black figure from Lily's drawing. One evening, huddled by the weak electric heater, he was trying to read Alara's diary again, searching for any overlooked clue, when his own hand, holding a pen to make a note, began to move. He watched, horrified, as his fingers, guided by some unseen force, began to write in a script that was not his own, the elegant, spidery hand of E. Vance. The apparatus is almost ready. The conduit is prepared. He only needs to accept his part. Elias cried out, dropping the pen as if it were red hot. He stared at his hand, flexing his fingers. It was his hand, yet it had betrayed him. He felt like a puppet, his strings pulled by an unseen, century-old master. The weather, mirroring his internal turmoil, worsened. A ferocious storm, even more violent than the last, descended upon Porthgarrow Head, cutting him off completely. The waves attacking the cliffs were monstrous, sending spray high over the lighthouse itself. The generator, after a series of violent spasms, finally gave up the ghost, plunging him into a terrifying, windswept darkness broken only by the intermittent, ghostly flashes of lightning. He was trapped. No chance of Penrose returning early in this. He was alone with the wind, the sea, and the increasingly insistent presences that haunted Porthgarrow. Armed with his flashlight, he made his way to the connecting walkway, drawn towards the lighthouse tower. The wind howled through the passage, threatening to tear him from his feet. He had to know. What was this apparatus? What sequence needed completing? As he entered the base of the tower, the rhythmic pulsing sensation was stronger than ever, a tangible throb in the stone floor, resonating up through his boots. The air was icy, and the smell of ozone from the storm mingled with the metallic tang he'd noticed on his first day, now stronger, sharper. He began the ascent, the flashlight beam dancing on the curving stone walls. Each step echoed unnaturally in the confined space. Halfway up, he saw it. Scratched into the stone of the wall, recently, by the look of the fresh dust beneath it, was a complex diagram, a circuit of some kind, incorporating the lighthouse lamp, strange symbols, and lines that seemed to indicate energy flows. And at the center of it, a small, stick-figure child. Lily. Beneath it, more spidery script, the heart of the storm. The voice of the lost. The blood of the keeper. Then the light will sing true. Blood of the keeper. His blood. A sudden, overwhelming wave of dizziness and nausea hit him. He leaned against the cold stone, gasping. The whispers swirled around him, a cacophony of voices, Ilara's weeping, Lily's humming, Thomas's despairing shouts, and underlying it all, a calm, malevolent chuckle that could only belong to E. Vance. He saw fleeting images superimposed on the darkness, Lily, her eyes wide with terror, being led up these very stairs by a tall, shadowy figure. Ilara, screaming her name from below. Thomas, struggling, then falling. The flashlight slipped from his numb fingers, clattering down the stone steps, plunging him into absolute blackness. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his daze. "No," he whispered. "This isn't real." A cold wisp of air brushed his cheek, like a child's breath. "Help me, Mr. Vance," Lily's voice whispered, directly in his ear. "He wants to make the sad song louder. Don't let him." Then, another voice, colder, deeper, resonant with ancient power, seemed to emanate from the very stones around him. "The final keeper will complete the work. It is time to awaken the true light of Porthgero. The little one will sing. You will provide the spark." Elias felt an invisible pressure, pushing him upwards, towards the lantern room. He stumbled, disoriented, his hands scrabbling against the rough walls. He had to get out, back to the cottage, barricade himself in. But his legs moved as if of their own accord, continuing the ascent. He was losing himself, his pragmatism, his sanity, all eroding under the relentless pressure of Porthgero's salt-stained sorrow and the chilling design of his namesake. The archivist was gone, replaced by a terrified man caught in a century-old tragedy that was rapidly, horrifyingly, becoming his own. Part 5, The Eye of the Storm. Elias stumbled into the lantern room, the wind screaming through the cracked panes of glass like a tormented soul. Lightning intermittently illuminated the vast, frozen Fresnel lens, its multifaceted surfaces reflecting a ghostly, fractured world. The great lamp mechanism, a complex web of brass and iron, stood silent and dark, yet the phantom pulse, the rhythmic throb, was almost unbearable here, vibrating through the iron floor, up his legs, into his very core. In the center of the room, barely visible in the gloom, stood a figure. Tall, impossibly thin, silhouetted against the raging storm. The black figure from Lily's drawing. E. Vance. Or what remained of him. He didn't turn, but his voice, the same cold, resonant voice Elias had heard on the stairs, filled the space. "You have arrived. As foretold. The final piece." Elias, backed against the curved wall of the lantern housing, could only stare. What are you?" he managed, his voice hoarse. "I am the conduit. The one who understood the true purpose of this place. Not merely a beacon for ships, but an amplifier. A resonator for the energies of the storm, the sorrow of the sea, the echoes of loss." The figure gestured vaguely towards the lens. "This magnificent instrument, it was designed for more than mere light." "You killed them," Elias whispered, the accusation raw. "Thomas, Ilara. Lily." "Sacrifice," the voice corrected, devoid of emotion. "To prime the apparatus. To attune it." Little Lily's song, her terror, her loss, it was the perfect catalyst. But it was incomplete. The storm that night, it wasn't strong enough. The keepers will faltered. A brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the figure more clearly. It was insubstantial, its edges blurred, composed more of shadow and swirling sea mist than solid form. Its eyes, however, burned with a cold, intelligent light. "And me?" Elias asked, dread coiling in his stomach. "Why me? Why my name?" A resonance. A sympathetic vibration across time. Your presence here, your name, your inherent connection to the task, it strengthens the bond, focuses the energies. You are the final keeper. You will provide the spark that Thomas Ashton could not. Your fear, your understanding, your despair, it will complete the circuit. The diagram he'd seen on the wall flashed in Elias's mind. The heart of the storm. The voice of the lost. The blood of the keeper. Suddenly, another presence made itself felt. A small, cold spot formed beside Elias. Lily's voice, tiny and desperate, whispered, "Don't let him sing his song, Mr. Vance. It hurts." The spectral Vance turned its head slowly, its burning eyes fixing on Elias. "She is still bound to this place, her echo trapped within the mechanism. Her song will power the true light. A light that will reach far beyond the horizon, calling to others." Others? The old ones. Those who sleep in the deep. This lighthouse, properly attuned, will be a beacon to draw them forth, to awaken them. A new age will dawn. Madness. Utter, terrifying madness. This Vance wasn't just a murderer, he was a zealot, a would-be summoner of Lovecraftian horrors. Elias's mind raced. He was an archivist, a man of books and quiet contemplation, not a hero. But Lily's plea, her tiny, spectral presence, ignited something within him, a spark of defiance. "No," he said, his voice surprisingly firm. "I won't help you." The Vance entity chuckled, a dry, rasping sound like shingle dragged by an undertow. "You have no choice. The storm is at its peak. The apparatus is primed. Your fear is already feeding it." Indeed, Elias could feel a strange energy building in the room, a prickling sensation on his skin. The phantom pulse of the lamp intensified, the air crackled. The faint, metallic smell was overpowering. He looked around wildly. His flashlight lay somewhere far below. The room was lit only by the storm. His eyes fell on a heavy iron pry bar, part of the original lamp maintenance toolkit, propped in a corner. If he could somehow disrupt the mechanism, break the lens further. But Vance was a step ahead. "Do you think to damage this magnificent creation? It is beyond mere physical destruction now. It is a conduit of energies you cannot comprehend." As if to prove his point, arcs of faint, blue energy began to dance between the metallic components of the lamp mechanism. The rhythmic throb became a jarring, painful shudder. The air grew colder still. Lily's voice came again, weaker this time. "The drawing, in the box, my drawing." Elias's mind latched onto her words. "The drawing. He waits for you to finish the light." But what if finish didn't mean complete? What if it meant end? He remembered the note signed by Vance, found with the drawing, "The light is not the only thing that failed here." Was that a lament, or a boast that his original plan had faltered? The words of Alara's diary echoed, he said it wasn't finished. He said the light needed a new song. A new song. Not Lily's song of terror. Perhaps a song of defiance. Of peace. Elias looked at the great, cracked Fresnel lens. It was designed to focus light, to project it. But what if it could also focus something else? Sound. Emotion. The lullaby. The salt-stained lullaby that Lily hummed, the one that seemed woven into the very fabric of Porthgaro. It was melancholic, yes, but also gentle. A song of comfort, twisted into a dirge by Vance's malevolence. "Lily," Elias said, his voice low, urgent. "Your lullaby. The real one. Can you sing it?" The cold spot beside him flickered. I don't remember all of it. He made it sad. Silence, child, boomed the Vance entity, the blue energy arcing more violently. Your sorrow is the key. No. Elias shouted, pushing away from the wall. He had to buy time, to disrupt Vance's ritual. He lunged for the pry bar. It was heavy, cold in his grip. He swung it wildly, not at the lens, but at one of the main supporting struts of the lamp mechanism, a thick iron rod. The bar connected with a deafening clang, sending shudders through the entire structure. The blue energy flickered erratically. The Vance entity recoiled, a hiss escaping its shadowy form. Fool! You cannot stop it. Try me. Elias yelled, adrenaline surging through him. He swung again, and again, the rhythmic clang of iron on iron, a desperate percussion against the storm's fury. He wasn't aiming to destroy the mechanism completely, he knew he couldn't, but to disrupt its resonance, to break the terrible harmony Vance was trying to achieve. Sing, Lily, he urged. Sing the lullaby as your mother sang it to you. Before he came. A faint, sweet melody began to weave its way through the chaos. Timid at first, then gaining strength. It was the lullaby, but different now, stripped of its terror, filled with a gentle, poignant sorrow, a longing for peace. Sleep, little one, the waves are sighing. The gulls are calling, day is dying. The blue energy around the lamp faltered, its rhythm disrupted by the clanging pry bar and the pure, clear notes of the child's song. The oppressive, metallic scent seemed to lessen. The Vance entity shrieked, a sound of fury and frustration. No. The attunement. You are breaking the sequence. Its form flickered violently, shadows writhing. Elias kept striking the mechanism, pouring all his fear, his desperation, his burgeoning anger into each blow. He felt a strange sense of connection to Thomas Ashton, the keeper who had failed to protect his family, now given a second chance through him. Lily's voice grew stronger, clearer, her song a shield against Vance's malevolent influence. Stars will watch you, moonbeams play. Till ocean whispers break of day. As she sang, Elias felt another presence join hers, a softer, maternal echo, harmonizing with the child's voice. Ilara. Her sorrow was still there, but it was now tinged with love, with protection. The storm outside seemed to pause, the wind's howl momentarily softening, as if listening. The lightning ceased. The Vance entity began to fragment, its form dissolving like smoke in a gale. This is not the song. The old ones, they will not hear. Its voice faded, filled with a dawning, ancient despair. The cold, burning light in its eyes dimmed. With one final, desperate effort, Elias swung the pry bar with all his might against a crucial-looking gear. There was a sharp crack, a grating screech, and a section of the lamp mechanism sagged, its intricate alignment broken. The blue energy sputtered and died. The oppressive, rhythmic pulse that had plagued Elias for days faded, leaving behind a profound, echoing silence within the lantern room. The spectral form of Vance uttered a last, fading sigh, a sound of utter defeat, and then was gone. Lily's lullaby, now joined fully by Ilara's gentle voice, filled the lantern room. It was no longer salt-stained with terror, but clean, pure, a song of release. Elias dropped the pry bar, his arms aching, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. He sank to his knees. The air was still cold, but the unnatural chill, the metallic tang, the oppressive dread, they were gone. He looked up at the great lens. In the faint, pre-dawn light that was beginning to filter through the dissipating storm clouds, he saw not a black, menacing figure, but two faint, shimmering forms, a woman with sad, kind eyes, protectively holding the hand of a small girl. They smiled at him, a gentle, grateful smile. Then, as the first rays of the rising sun touched the lantern, they began to fade, not with despair, but with a sense of peace, of finality. The lullaby softened, becoming one with the sigh of the receding wind and the distant murmur of the calming sea. Elias Vance, the archivist, the final keeper, watched them go. He had not finished the light in the way Vance had intended. He had helped to extinguish a darkness, and in doing so, had allowed 2 lost souls, and perhaps himself, to find a measure of peace. Part 6, The Quiet Dawn. The sun, when it finally broke free of the horizon, painted the churning sea in hues of apricot and rose. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air sharp and tasting only of salt and damp earth. Elias remained in the lantern room for a long time, watching the dawn. He was exhausted, bruised, and emotionally scoured, but a profound sense of quietude had settled over him. The oppressive atmosphere of Porthgero, the weight of its sorrow, had lifted. The tower no longer pulsed with a phantom heartbeat, the wind no longer carried whispers of dread, only the natural sighs of air currents over stone. He eventually made his way back down the spiral staircase, his steps heavy but sure. The diagram scratched into the wall was still there, but it seemed inert now, just marks on stone, its malevolent power neutralized. The cottage, when he re-entered it, felt different. Still old, still isolated, but no longer threatening. The faint scent of lavender was gone, as was the cloying smell of seawater and despair. It was just a tired, empty building, waiting for its final chapter. He found Alara Ashton's diary where he'd left it. He picked it up, his gaze falling on her last, desperate entry. With a deep sigh, he closed the book. Her story, and Lily's, and Thomas's, had been heard, their tragedy acknowledged, their echoes finally allowed to fade. The child's drawing was still in the metal box. He looked at it again. The lighthouse, the black figure. He waits for you to finish the light. Lily's innocent hand had recorded a warning, a plea, and perhaps, unknowingly, the key to its undoing. He spent the next few days in a state of subdued activity. His official task of cataloging the archive seemed almost trivial now. Yet he approached it with a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet respect for the lives these documents represented. He found no more spectral entries, no objects moving on their own, no chilling whispers. The ordinary, mundane nature of the records was almost a comfort. He tidied the cottage, packing away the personal effects of the Ashtons with care, placing Alara's diary and Lily's drawing inside the rusted metal box, alongside the note from the first Vance. He would take this box with him. It was not part of the official archive, but it was the heart of Porthgero's true story. When the new date for Jacob Penrose's arrival came, 3 weeks and 2 days after his initial landing, the delay caused by the great storm, Elias was ready. His archival boxes were neatly stacked, his personal gear packed. The sea serpent appeared as a speck on the horizon, growing steadily larger against the backdrop of a calm, blue sea. Penrose, when he finally cut the engine at the small inlet, looked at Elias with a curious, searching gaze. "Heard it was a right howler of a storm out here, Mr. Vance," he said, his voice neutral. "You look like you've seen a thing or two." Elias managed a faint smile. "You could say that, Mr. Penrose." As they loaded his gear onto the boat, Penrose paused, looking up at the silent, weathered lighthouse. "Wind's dropped a bit, ain't she? Quieter than I've known it in years around the head." Elias nodded. "Yes. I think the old songs have finished." Penrose grunted, saying nothing more, but as they pulled away from Porthgero Head, Elias saw the boatman glance back at the lighthouse one last time, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, perhaps understanding, or simply the ingrained caution of a man who knew the sea held more secrets than it ever revealed. Elias didn't look back. He carried Porthgero with him, not as a place of terror, but as a testament to the enduring power of memory, the weight of unresolved sorrow, and the unexpected strength found in facing the darkness, both within and without. His report to the National Maritime Archive would be concise, factual, detailing the contents of the lighthouse and cottage, recommending their final disposition. He would make no mention of spectral engineers, whispering children, or salt-stained lullabies. Some stories, he now understood, belonged not in official records, but in the quiet archives of the human heart. As Porthgero light receded into the Cornish mist, Elias Vance felt a profound sense of release. The solitude he had sought had been anything but quiet, yet in its crucible, he had found a strange, unsettling peace. He was no longer just an archivist, he was a keeper of a different kind of story, one that would stay with him, a silent echo, for the rest of his days. The sea was calm, and for the first time in a long while, so was he.